in Venezuela. Today, we're going to keep the momentum going with 3 fantastic discussions over across this morning. Per usual, I encourage you, if you were looking for Spanish or Portuguese translations, to go to the bottom of your screen and hit the interpretation tab, where you're able to move over to Spanish or Portuguese at your preference. Again, this morning, we're going to have a fantastic keynote address, followed by the re-examine of the 2003 Declaration on Security in the Americas, an important piece of bi-state partnerships, multilateralism, understanding the security considerations driving the region, and whether we need to evolve that to account for the future threats facing our region. Then we're going to go into disinformation, democracy in the inter-American system, and look at the role that disinformation can play across the region. But I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I do want to turn it over to our moderator for this next discussion. And he is someone that is very familiar to this group and someone that's actually keynoted a couple years ago in Miami, the Hemispheric Security Conference. Juan Cruz is the director of the Argentina-U.S. Strategic Forum and a non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously served as special assistant to the president and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2017 to 2019. Few know more about the region and the security considerations in the region. I think he's had posts in pretty much every country. Isn't that right, Juan? Brazil, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, right? You've been everywhere across the region, so I cannot think of any better person to help moderate this next discussion than Mr. Juan Cruz. Juan, I will turn it over to you.
Good morning, Randy, and thank you for that introduction, and thanks to FIU for having me. I'm tickled that I'll be able to moderate this segment. This morning, the segment of this keynote address, I have to really applaud our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Carrie Hannon, who is stepping in this morning for our original keynote speaker, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Ricardo Zúñiga, who was pulled away on family matters. And so Carrie's been dynamite. And I'll add to that she's significantly under the weather. So I take my hat off to her. I'll try to be kind and gentle, but those of you who know me know that that's probably an empty promise. Carrie Hannon is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, and she's our Deputy Assistant Secretary at Western Hemisphere, and her particular portfolio is public diplomacy, policy planning, and coordination. But she has this very enviable job of also being the primary DAS in charge of issues having to do with the People's Republic of China. And I know that that's a subject that all of us attending here the conference are super interested in. So we'll probably be looking forward to hearing from Carrie on that as well. She previously serves as the director of the Office of Press and Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. And also she was the deputy chief of mission and the charge d'affaires at our embassy in Luxembourg. She also served as a senior advisor in the Office of Policy Planning and Resources for the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. She has previous assignments in the region, including Bolivia, Argentina, India. Importantly, she was a spokesperson in our embassy in Kabul, and she's held multiple assignments in the hardest place of all, Washington, D.C. And among those that stand out are, of course, the enviable job of serving in State Department's Operations Center. Ms. Hannon has an undergraduate degree in zoology, but she has a master's degree in Latin American studies with a concentration in tropical conservation development from the University of Florida. She speaks French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dari. And with that brief introduction, please, let's welcome Carrie. Take over.
Hi, thank you, Juan. Good morning, and I'm really glad to be here virtually with all of you today. I'd also like to thank our host, Florida International University, and to everyone here, whether virtually or in person at FIU. This important annual gathering to reflect on the most pressing security challenges facing the Western Hemisphere comes less than 3 weeks before we kick off the US-hosted 9th Summit of the Americas. The summit's going to provide an important platform for the United States to carry out the administration's vision for the region. President Biden seeks to promote cooperation toward inclusive economic growth and prosperity based on our shared respect for democracy, fundamental freedoms, the dignity of labor, and free enterprise. Today's gathering and the summit comes at a time when globally democracies are facing great challenges. Nowhere have we seen this unfold more clearly than through Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the effects of which we can see right here in our own hemisphere. Households across the region are forced to make agonizing choices as the cost of living skyrockets. We also see the enduring struggle for democracy and freedom as Ukrainians fight to save their nation, providing a clear signal that a threat to democracy anywhere poses a threat to democracies everywhere. We recognize that while democratic institutions with free and fair elections remain the norm in most countries throughout the hemisphere, in many countries, the challenges they face outpace their capacity to meet their citizens' aspirations. The hollow promises of populist and authoritarian leaders have greater appeal when democratic institutions fail to provide essential public services. We also see where pervasive corruption undermines the development of accountable democracies and inclusive economies, benefiting a corrupt and privileged few. That's why, throughout the Western Hemisphere, the administration, the State Department, and the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs are all committed to aligning our resources to help our democratic partners equitably deliver public goods, strengthen people's faith in democracy, and build safe, inclusive, prosperous, equitable, and climate-resilient societies. I'd like to highlight just a few priorities in particular. First, we are committed to working through regional fora, like the Organization of American States, and alongside leaders throughout the hemisphere, to defend freedom and democracy and to seek to end impunity. We strongly support the democratic aspirations of those oppressed by the authoritarian regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. In Cuba, we seek to promote human rights, religious freedom, labor rights, and democracy. We encourage the development of more open telecommunications and the internet, and we support a private sector that operates free of government control. We seek to catalyze growth of Cuba's independent civil society. We impose sanctions on Cuban military and security leaders in response to the regime's violent suppression of free expression and peaceful assembly in the days and weeks following the July 11 protests last year. Last November, the Reinforcing Nicaragua's Adherence to Conditions for Electoral Reform, Renacer Act, passed with broad bipartisan support and expanded the corrupt and undemocratic actors list to include Nicaragua. On March 9th, we added the first 9 Nicaraguans to this list for their role in subverting the November 21 national elections in Nicaragua. To date, we have sanctioned 46 individuals and 9 entities in Nicaragua and imposed visa restrictions on more than 280 people for facilitating the Ortega Murillo's regime's repression. Through our political support and development assistance to the Guaido-led interim government, the Unitary Platform, and democratic organizations within and outside of Venezuela, the United States supports the protection of human rights, the promotion of civil society, the restoration of democratic institutions, and a commitment to promote transparency and regime accountability. Since 2017, the United States has provided more than $1.66 billion in humanitarian assistance to Venezuelan refugees and vulnerable migrants inside Venezuela and throughout the region. So we're bringing all our tools and resources to bear to promote a return to democracy where these authoritarian regimes persist, and we are trying to improve the day-to-day lives of all those who suffer under their repression. Second, to achieve prosperity and long-term security in the region, it is essential that all members of society can participate politically, have equal economic opportunity, and enjoy access to healthcare and education. As a whole, democratic governments in Latin America and the Caribbean have delivered some notable progress in providing prosperity, security, and stability. We've seen increasing living standards and access to education, a decrease in infant mortality and maternal mortality, and a rise in Latin America's middle class. Despite this, however, we've witnessed growing inequality alongside the economic growth, contributing to citizens' frustrations with their governments. We see great strengths in the region. The Western Hemisphere boasts a large adult population and a large young adult population and rich cultural, social, economic, and geographic diversity. But in every country of the region, historically marginalized groups, including African descendant, indigenous, LGBTQI+ persons, women and girls, and persons with disabilities, face barriers and discrimination, preventing them from fully participating in political, economic, and social life. We are committed to working in partnership with civil society, the private sector, and partners inside and outside the region to promote human rights for all. We have bilateral agreements with Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay that focus on racial and ethnic equality and social inclusion, and advanced cooperation on gender equality and women's economic and political empowerment. We can only succeed in building stronger, safer, more equitable societies through the deliberate inclusion of the most vulnerable groups. Third, as part of our mission to achieve a secure hemisphere, we are committed to addressing conditions in Northern Central America that have fueled irregular migration. The U.S. strategy for addressing the root causes of irregular migration in Central America aims to achieve a democratic, prosperous, and safe Central America, where everyone can advance economically, live, work, and learn in safety and dignity, contribute to and benefit from the democratic process, have confidence in public institutions, and enjoy opportunities to create futures for themselves and their families at home. We understand that sustainable results will take time and progress will not be linear. But by addressing labor market informality, strengthening the rule of law, and combating gang-related and sexual and gender-based violence, we can help Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Salvadorans create the futures they desire for themselves and their families in their own countries. Likewise, countering transnational criminal organizations and their activities through initiatives like the U.S.-Mexico Bicentennial Framework on Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities will lead to a safer environment for citizens of both countries. We are committed to working with governments to address structural impediments to investment and expanding access to financial capital for women, youth, and minority-owned businesses. We work with our partners to promote transparency in electoral systems through reform and enforcement of electoral campaign finance rules and open list systems to allow for direct representation. In April, we launched the United States-Honduras Strategic Dialogue, where we announced plans to continue working with Honduras to promote respect for human rights, including addressing gender-based violence. We're working with partners across the region to develop and sign a regional declaration on migration and protection at the summit in Los Angeles. This will underscore our shared responsibility to address all forms of migration as we develop a set of priorities to strengthen humane migration management, provide protection to those who need it, and reduce irregular migration throughout the hemisphere. We also see our foreign assistance and security cooperation with partner nations as critical components of our broader strategic goals of fostering a more democratic, inclusive, secure, and prosperous hemisphere. The State Department and USAID will implement $1.8 billion in fiscal year 2021 foreign assistance throughout the hemisphere. Our programs support good governance, inclusive economic development, and improved citizen security. Roughly $675 million of our fiscal year 21 assistance supports training and equipment for partner security forces, including law enforcement agencies and militaries. Crucially, promoting respect for human rights is central to our security cooperation programs. Professional security forces that respect democratic governance and human rights form critical pillars to the democratic order that we value and defend. That is why we take special care to vet every unit and person that will receive assistance, ensuring we train and cooperate with security forces that share our values. When people think of our security cooperation in the Western Hemisphere, they often think first of our rock-solid partnership with Colombia. Our partnership with Colombia remains a pillar of foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and the Secretary participated last October in the 10th high-level dialogue with Colombia. But just as important, if less well-known, is our security cooperation in the Caribbean. In 2010, the United States, CARICOM, and the Dominican Republic launched the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, Cbsi, a partnership and U.S. foreign assistance program designed to build Caribbean capacity to reduce illicit trafficking, improve public safety, and prevent youth crime and violence. Since 2010, the United States has committed more than $830 million for Cbsi. On May 25th, the United States will participate in the 10th high-level Caribbean-U.S. Security Cooperation Dialogue to review our shared progress under Cbsi. There we'll also address 4 top priority security challenges raised by our Caribbean partners: firearms trafficking, illicit maritime trafficking, cybercrime, and trafficking in persons. As you all know, illicit trafficking in the Caribbean contributes to violence and gang-related crime in the region. For instance, Jamaica ranks 10th globally and 1st in the Western Hemisphere for homicides. Jamaican youth are often the main victims and perpetrators. Building on past successes with community-based policing, USAID helps strengthen the relationship between citizens, especially young people, and law enforcement in targeted communities. USAID also supports youth development programs that address prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation. In closing, the Western Hemisphere stands at a crossroads. Democracies face great challenges. Social exclusion and inequality create instability across the region and pose a risk we must help our partners address. Democratic institutions have not always delivered the public goods their citizens demand: good governance, rule of law, citizen security, economic opportunity, healthcare, education. We don't have all the answers. We face plenty of challenges right here at home, so we approach this work with a spirit of humility and partnership. But we do have some lessons learned and resources to share. So we're focused on doing what we can, where we can, to help democracies deliver for their people. And that means all of their people. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions, Juan.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Thanks for that detailed, thoughtful, and comprehensive outlook. Word for our participants. What we'll do is I have some areas of conversation with Carrie, but I'd welcome any questions and answers that we'll try to address at the end of the conversation. Please take advantage of the chat function. For that, I'll be monitoring the chat as well. Carrie, you've given us a lot to think about, covered a lot of terrain and territory. And what I'd like to do is, one of the subjects that has been reoccurring, lots of interest throughout the conference to date has been the issue of the Summit of the Americas, who's going, who's not going, what we're going to cover. And I thought with such a keen interest and that we'd set some foundational questions. So my first one, bear with me, it's a little long, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to sort of set the stage where we are. So, the Summit of the Americas and most summits usually are cloaked in some sort of controversy. And that's certainly been the case with this 9th summit, where we've seen a lot of said, and we can get into that later, but that's not really what I want to cover. What I want to get into is I'd like for you to lay out for us the actual vision for the summit. What does it look like? Who's going to be present? What themes are we going to cover? And more importantly, what the outcomes look like if, State today would be able to script the whole thing and say, this is what a really strong summit would look like, and this is what we would cover.
Boy, if I could script the summit, we'd go back in time a year and lay it out. I think this summit, I don't want to get the 5. There are 5 themes that we're focused on for the summit, which I'm sure DMP, as we like to call her, raised yesterday. But our goal is to come up with a solid list of deliverables, to use government speak, that align with the needs that our partners and the attendees at the summit come up with. So we're dealing with clean energy, we're dealing with green future, we're dealing with responding to the pandemic and economic recovery, creating opportunities for all populations in the region, equitable access to economic, social, and political opportunities. I think what's also interesting about this summit are the 3 forums that happen that I don't think people realize all the time. Everybody's focused on the leaders and those meetings that we have during the 2 days. But on the margins of the summit, you're going to see 3 forums. The CEO forum, which brings together not just CEOs, but medium and small enterprise businesses interested in the hemisphere and the economics in the hemisphere, but also the youth forum and the civil society forum. This is a little bit niche, but I'm excited because the youth forum, we're bringing up 5 of our Young Leaders of the Americas Initiative fellows to participate. That's a large network of Latin American and Caribbean entrepreneurs who come together every year to learn how to be stronger entrepreneurs and build a network. And so the summit is just one vehicle for them to come together and create opportunities in their own communities. The civil society and the Civil Society Forum is another opportunity to discuss key issues that our partners face from civil society. All countries are invited to attend there. And of course, the CEO Forum is always an interesting place for conversations to happen. If what I would like to see is robust conversation. I would like to see leaders discussing the hard problems that we all face in the region. I think some cross-cutting issues are going to be disinformation, which I know you're having a session on later. I think that's a really critical issue that we've seen amplified, especially with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think also irregular migration is an issue that the entire hemisphere is dealing with, and we're aggressively working together to try and find solutions to improve the safety for the migrants and find economic opportunities to reduce it.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to continue with this this thread on the summit. And as you know, the summit has received some bad press, both domestically and internationally. In the region, they haven't been particularly kind. But this week, there was one article in a major international outlet that referred to, quote, the waning U.S. influence, end quote, sort of vis-a-vis China, and particularly if we don't pull off something worthwhile at the summit. What's your reaction to that statement? You probably didn't get a chance to read the article, but it's one that basically says the U.S. either pulls off a good summit, or this is exactly an indication of sort of a great power losing its influence in an area that it's dominated for decades.
No, I appreciate the question. It sounds a lot like talking points I'm hearing coming out of some of our competitors as we lay them out about how our influence is waning in the region. I bet if we went back press to prior summits or any major meeting that we've hosted, you've probably seen that criticism too. And yet we are still the preferred partner in the region. We are still here. We are still contributing to economic prosperity. We are still partnering with democracies that want to partner. I think the summit is, the criticism is always going to be there. It is a meeting. It is an important meeting. It is a rare opportunity to bring all of the leaders together to partner with what I certainly believe is the most important partner in the region overall. We've been there with Latin America and the Caribbean for years. I mean, I'm not going to put a number on it. I mean, we're celebrating 200 years of relations with Colombia this year, with Mexico this year. I mean, we are the premier partner. And that criticism is going to be there. But I think where the rubber meets the road is when we have those meetings, when we look for those deliverables, when we figure out ways to use the assistance to help address some of these really important scenarios that we've laid out. We're going to develop a resilient, a sustainable, a green future, but we need to be in it together.
Carrie, I've been advised by the Zoom gods that I committed a faux pas that I might be monitoring the chat function, but there's actually a question and answer tab that people can use. So I'll be monitoring where I'm not going to get a paycheck for this time. So I'll be monitoring both of those. Carrie, you mentioned something about, both in your comments and just now in your response about Russia and the Ukraine and impact. And I was wondering, because it's not a theme that I think is necessarily directly addressed, but you think you'll have a chance to discuss sort of the impact of the crisis on the region, or it's been noticed that a few of the major countries haven't been very vociferous in criticizing Russia, and they've been very careful. Is there any room for us to exercise any sort of diplomacy in the summit regarding the crisis in the Ukraine?
I don't know what specifically related to Russia and the Ukraine will happen at the summit. I won't be party to conversations that happen on the margins or behind closed doors. But I can say that, we have been aggressively messaging within the region using our social media properties, meaning U.S. Embassy, U.S. government, to make sure and letting our partners understand the influence of disinformation coming out of RT and Sputnik, sharing the impact of what's happening in Ukraine. We did this incredible program in Central America where we were able to bring Ukrainian journalists in Ukraine to talk to Latin American journalists in Central America so that they could get ground truth reality about what's happening from the source. So if you don't want to hear it from us, let's talk to some Ukrainians to understand what's really happening. And that information, I think people understand. I think for the vast majority, if you look at the way that our nations in the Caribbean and South America have voted in multilateral institutions, they also condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. For those countries that have not perhaps aligned themselves with democracy, and there is a risk. And if you want to align yourself with a nation that treats its people that way or doesn't respect sovereignty, you're setting a precedent. I also think that when we talk about the conversations we're having about whether or not, we have been pretty clear about what will be the implications of supporting Russia and their actions in Ukraine with some other countries. But we continue to talk to our partners in the region to make them understand what's happening and who the real bad guy is.
Thank you, Carrie. Carrie, you also mentioned the issue of security in your comments, and security per se as a specific theme is not covered in the ninth summit, but that's not fair to say, right? Because security is covered in the agenda in a lot of the themes that you laid out. Could you parcel that out for us? Could you sort of underscore these are security themes, or where there's a room for security discussions to take place around some of the major themes of the summit?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I don't think we don't have a security as a top line, but security, citizen security, rule of law, judicial reform is all inherently built into the structure of any conversation we have with leadership or civil society in the region. Anything that we're doing that addresses economic opportunity is also providing, gangs thrive where there's corruption. People lean into, don't expect their governments to deliver, and therefore they rely on broken systems or gangs to provide security. But if you have strong rule of law, if you have strong judicial systems, if you have prosecutorial reform, then people trust institutions, governments can deliver, security is improved. So anything that we do in all of these areas, I mean, climate change has an impact on security. I mean, there is not a topic that we have laid out as a potential for discussion or conversation at the summit that, if improved, doesn't improve citizen security, reduce transnational crime, improve the capacity of a government to deliver for its people. So it is woven throughout.
And I would even include disinformation in that, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, disinformation. Yeah, I could talk all day about disinformation, and I think that the threats to free media, threats to journalists in general, both their safety but also their ability to report. Nicaraguan journalists are in exile, have had to leave Nicaragua, are bravely telling the stories that are happening there. I mean, it is critical. Absolutely critical that citizens have access to accurate information, and the ability to manipulate information, to influence elections, to influence public opinion is scary. It scares me because I think it's the next battlefront, I think. Personally.
I mean, there's tremendous interest in a lot of mystery surrounding it, right? And a lot of false narrative, people not understanding exactly what it is and how it can impact on them. So I think, if we do it right at the summit, there's a lot of opportunity for sharing knowledge and being able to prepare people for the impact of this.
Absolutely.
I have a hard question here for you, I think. This week, there's a U.S. team in Mexico meeting with counterparts precisely on the issue of the summit and summit matters. What can you share about how it's going, objectives? Do you have any scoops for us?
I have no scoops. I'm aware of that trip, and I know that it's important that we want to see all leaders and all democratic nations present at the summit. And so hopefully any conversations that are happening in Mexico will help pave the way for that. But I have no scoops, unfortunately.
Well, okay, but that's interesting, because as we know, there are a handful of countries that have threatened with not going, or at least expressed a concern that if others aren't invited, namely Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, then how can they attend? But let's be honest, if we have something like migration on the agenda, and we don't have at the table, and I know you've distinguished this, but if we don't have at the table Mexico, Guatemala, or Honduras, or Salvador, what could that look like at the summit? Addressing the issue of migration without Mexico, or with a delegation that's not at the presidential level, or what does it look like if if one or more of the Central American countries don't attend, and yet we have this theme? How do we handle that?
Well, I don't want to be a pessimist, so I'm going to make the assumption that everybody's coming. How do we handle it? I don't want to be speculative. but we've been having dialogues ongoing about these important issues with all of our partners for ages. So, the summit is an incredibly important and public opportunity to raise these issues at the top level with senior leadership. And when I say senior, I mean POTUS, the presidents. It's an opportunity to draw attention to what I think gets lost in all of the media that is focusing on who's going to attend and who's not, and trying to take political stands. The Cubans are loving this. Getting the attention that they get for not attending and continuing to bang that drum. But in reality, it's the stuff that I mentioned before on the edges of the summit. It's the conversations that are going to be happening. It's the ability to understand each other. It's the civil society forum, the youth forum, where we're really going to have conversations that will, in the long term, address the underpinning root causes of migration, because we're signing migration arrangements. We're working with governments to try and address the threats, the border security. All of that is happening. But this is such a complex picture. And the summit is a focal point to talk about those complex issues that we face and try and find solutions.
You mentioned the Cuba piece, and I can't help but think that the Cuban government gets a kick out of all this noise that they've made about the attendance, and then of course the accompanying noise they make and holding up articles or sentiments that play to their narrative on the summit. And I can't help but think that they enjoy that a lot more than they would if they sat at the actual summit. And who knows if we'd invite them, if they would even go. I have my doubts. But anyway, they thrive in this atmosphere of chaos and be able to manipulate the information. And
yeah, I agree. The more that they can shine the light on us and call us the bad guy, they're avoiding the fact that the repression that they've been actively perpetrating against their people since July 11th. I mean, the amount of repression and suffering that the Cuban people have, the human rights violations, that's a lot less. They don't want the press on that. They want the press on us not inviting them to the summit or not. Well, you know what? Stop repressing your people.
The hypocrisy of it.
Yeah, the hypocrisy plays well in the media, as we probably all know.
You spoke about having a positive outlook and having a summit where everyone shows up. And so we've spoken about a handful of countries that perhaps, it has to do with the attendance or non-attendance of these three countries we've already mentioned, but it's more difficult to discern why a handful of other countries have expressed doubt about attending. And what could we do to encourage them to turn the page and show up? And to name names, I'm thinking Brazil, Guatemala, maybe Salvador, where there's a reluctance, where there's a perceived reluctance that maybe they're not wanted or they wouldn't enjoy themselves, or that. How do we address that and get them to overlook that, or find that the summit provides a great place to have those hard discussions? Why don't you come and we'll talk about it in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think you answered the question. Any country that doesn't want to come is losing the opportunity to talk to us. And, you can be, it's weird to speak of a country as a person, but a country can be mad at another country or feel like, we're not giving you the full hand. How do I say that? It's weird to talk about countries and sort of people. So I'll speak about people. You can be mad at a person and not think that they're giving you a fair shake. But the reality is we've been in this region for so long, partnering, trying to help these countries deal with some of the challenges that they face. We deal with any government democratically elected. We want to see success. We share partnership. We care about what happens in the region. This is our region. So how do we get them to come to the summit? The summit matters. We continue to message them that the summit matters. We have 2 special advisors out and about. Special advisor Dodd is down there, is traveling right now, making sure that any leader that has any kind of skepticism or point to be made gets a chance to say what they feel. It's better to be in the room complaining about how you're treated than to sit outside and throw stones. So if we can share, look, we're willing to listen. We want you at the table. Again, I'm sort of speaking in generalities about nations that have incredibly complex histories and problems and issues to distress, and they can't be broken down into one conversation. But none of those conversations happen if you're not at the table. Will we solve all of them? Will we address them? Will you get the result you want? No, but at least we're in the room having the conversation, and that relationship continues. To think that you could ever not want to partner with the United States, to me, again, as the eternal optimist, is crazy. I mean, we are here. We are your partner of choice. Don't take a stand and end up harming yourself.
Well, let's continue on that, because you've used, you want to be optimistic. And so let's give this, what message is there for China, deliberate or otherwise, in pulling off a successful summit?
For China?
So we get what you just said, a summit like the region deserves, a good summit, everything. What's China's takeaway on that?
Well, China wants us to declare some kind of I think that I'm trying to say this in a way so I say this correctly, but China wants to say this is our part of the world, that's your part of the world. And that's not what we're saying. We're talking about partnership, right? We are partners with the country in this region. We share issues with the countries in the hemisphere because we're in the same hemisphere. We're dealing with similar issues: climate change, irregular migration. And so what that sends to the message that it sends to China is that the United States is still a valid and valued partner to the nations. We don't want China not to partner in the region. What we have always asked for is transparency, to follow social and labor laws when you do offer infrastructure projects, that that countries here have their eyes open in the hemisphere if they partner with China or other vendors. We're not saying we're your only partner of choice. It's a globe, but we are saying we are, look who's been there for you all along. Look who helped build your health system. When you look at who was there, who was there when the hurricanes happened, who does disaster relief, who's done military training, who's brought the Mercy ship. We are a long-term partner to the region. And what we're showing China is basically the same story. The summit is not a change. It's not a change of course. It's the next summit that's been going on since '94. It's us talking to our partners in the region about the issues that we confront and looking for solutions.
Perfect. Now, I've been monitoring the correct tabs, and I've tried to incorporate some of the general themes in the discussion we've had today. But I'm going to read one or two of the questions that either have the most themes of all the questions asked, or that are entirely new, right? So let me read this one to you. It has been announced that a hemispheric declaration of migration will be signed on the margins of the summit. Do you know when this would take place and what countries would sign on to this? What are the expectations for such a declaration? Is that too far in the weeds for you, or?
No, I'm aware of the signing. I'm aware that that is an aim of the summit, to sign the Los Angeles. I'm not going to get the title exactly right.
Sure.
But yeah, I have to acknowledge that I couldn't tell you. I can opine that the goal is to find solutions to address. I would focus on the things that the White House and this administration have focused on, the root causes of irregular migration. But there's probably, because it's not just, remember, I sit in the State Department seat, but there's a much broader conversation happening across the US government related to border enforcement and protections, and what happens when Title 42, if it stops being enforced. There's a whole suite of issues that need to be addressed that are going to have long-term impacts. And so I'm going to opine that this is going to start laying out next steps for how we deal with migration in the coming years, to include addressing root causes, which is really where the State Department and USAID and many other agencies spend their time, trying to help nations, create resiliency and encourage people not to leave their home countries, to deal with violence, to deal with providing opportunity for youth, all of those things.
Well, speaking of which, one of these questions is, it is very positive that there are forums that accompany the summit for young people, civil society, CEOs. What instruments are there to move any of those agreements into practice?
Agreements that come out of the forums? I don't know. I think that what I can say, so I've been sitting on the margins of the summit organization team, right? Our national coordinator sits in my office, and then my team, which is public diplomacy, and has a large team that's put together a media event on June 7th that's going to talk about disinformation, but also journalist integrity. We've worked with OAS. We're doing a lot in that space. We also are working. I have seen so many interested partners that want to support the summit, that are already working in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, are already invested in the people, in the economies, in addressing some of the issues that the nations face and that the citizenry faces. And they are committed to coming to the summit to both showcase products, opportunities, investments, to contribute to some of the problems we're facing. And it is amazing. Organizations, non-government, civil society, private sector want to contribute to the summit. So in terms of what we're going to see, I think it's going to be massive. The kinds of, when I say deliverables, there's government deliverables, like here's, foreign assistance to address this issue, but there's also, hey, Amazon's going to do this, or company you've never heard of is actually investing millions and millions of dollars. I don't want to just use Amazon. I mean, I don't mean to shout out for Amazon, but they are sort of prevalent. But there are so many companies, investment companies and media companies, just committed to the region, committed to the people. And I also want to highlight, since we announced it was going to be in LA, our the State Department and other agencies in the government have gone out to LA and had these unbelievably interesting conversations, really in-depth conversations with the diaspora out there. I mean, the diaspora in LA, we live in the Beltway. I'm sitting in DC, I'm talking to my tiny little square of people. You go out to LA and there's a whole world of El Salvadorans and Guatemalans and Central Americans from elsewhere, and South Americans, and they have perspective and they have ideas and they have concerns and they have so much information. And the city of Los Angeles has been an incredible partner. They have incredible contacts. We're partnering with universities out there. There's just so much energy around the summit that we're tapping into being in LA. And there's events that are going to happen in Miami too that are supporting the summit. I mean, the entire country has elements led by diaspora organizations that are supporting the summit. So I wouldn't just, I couldn't give you a list because it'd be 10 pages long.
Okay, I'm gonna read 3 questions for you, and so that the idea is so that you can take a common theme and respond to them. You don't have, because we can't get to all of these. But so the first one is, what is the U.S. doing to link security priorities to economic priorities in the region? Second question, looking at the Caribbean in specific, what conversations have you had with the Caribbean nations regarding specific security threats facing them? And then I think I'll read this one as the third one, is how constructive has the USA been in working with regional organizations as opposed to taking unilateral decisions to tackle security challenges?
Did you say USAID?
USA, the US.
Oh, US, the USA.
Yeah.
The last question was, how have they done working with regional versus
doing it on their own?
But
the US doing it unilaterally.
Oh, I mean, okay. So the third question, we're always going to do better to partner. Either it's, and Haiti's a perfect example of strength. We can't instill order in Haiti. That's up to the Haitian National Police, and we have given them funding and training and observers to the UN mission. I think it's the UN mission, to help them develop the capacity to address the security situation and gang violence in Haiti, as an example. The Caribbean faces a lot of security issues, if I understand the question. I think one interesting area we're working on, we work a lot with them on energy security, which you might think, how is that related to depending on how you interpret security, but energy and resilience to climate change is an incredibly important issue that the White House is heavily focused on. They've signed a new agreement or revitalized an agreement that was already existing to talk about climate security. We've got development money going there. We want the Caribbean to be able to provide for their own energy, to be resilient, to not be dependent on other nations, and to have clear and transparent and fair bidding practices when they build out this infrastructure, all of which contributes to the third question, which is, what kinds of issues do we address broadly that touch security I think anti-corruption is probably one of the most important areas that we work in. You say, well, because I use this, I talked to Congress a couple of weeks ago, and they were like, what does corruption have to do with China? But corruption has to do with everything. If you don't address the threat, if people don't trust systems because the corruption is there at all levels, and I'm talking about bribing the police officer to corporations having to pay governments in order to get fair bidding, to be able to even bid on a contract, the whole system collapses. There's no security there. So that in turn will lead to gangs being able to capitalize on broken systems. Therefore, there's gang violence, there's impunity. I mean, the entire I know there are academics on this call who have probably mapped out incredibly complex systems that explain where it comes from. But the point is, there are so many issues that we work on that, if we could just turn a lever. I mean, I think I was talking to Juan yesterday briefly, and I said, we could have an entire conversation about maternal health or childhood education. We could probably address security in the hemisphere if we put money into maternal health. And there is an absolute arrow between those two topics. There's an absolute arrow between childhood education and prison reform and judicial reform and training police. I mean, every issue is about empowering a citizenry to demand from their democracies what they need in order, and governments can provide security if, it's a dance, it's a dialogue. It's a very complicated one, but.
Well, I heard one of your comments above is efforts to have outreach with educational institutions, universities out in California. And I've always found that some of the greatest interest in these summits are by players outside of government. And I think we've talked a little bit about that, but it goes to this question: what role can universities, think tanks, and other groups play in supporting U.S. objectives in the region?
Well, you can host conferences that bring experts together so we can actually share information. I think that the research that you do, I'm party to, I don't know how many people on this call are aware of 100,000 Strong, but that's a flagship program that the Western Hemisphere Bureau has had since 2012, if I'm not mistaken, where we do university partnerships between U.S. universities and universities in the region. It's funded private sector. I've also done it in South and Central Asia. We did university partnerships. Actually, I hosted an FIU visit in Argentina when I was there, bringing universities down to visit institutions, sharing academic knowledge, targeting some of that academic exchange onto issues that matter, like STEM, critical minerals, research into climate change, developing new technologies. I mean, the brain power. I know that the question may have been aimed more at like the political challenges that we face, but there's also incredible scientific challenges, and some would argue, I'm in that camp, that climate change is the greatest problem facing the world, full stop. And so when we're able to utilize university expertise, indigenous skill sets, I mean, there's so much knowledge out there that I, sitting in a government office, can't access. The people who are probably closest to it are academics. And those academics, if I can find a way to link academics with academics in the US and share that knowledge and develop, hybrid technologies and share information, there's an incredible opportunity there. And so some of the stuff that doesn't get the attention in the media are things like Fulbright programs and university partnerships and student exchange. These are the places where real change happens. It's not fast, it's not bilateral, it's not coming out of a summit, but the impact that I have seen of some of our university partnerships, the impact that some of our exchange participants have made because they came to the US, they went to a US university, they were exposed to an idea that they would not have been exposed to if they had not come to the US, and the reverse. American students going to Latin America and being exposed to new technologies and new ideas and new problem sets and working with people there has greatly enriched the intellectual capacity of our world. And so that's a little high-minded. I acknowledge that. I also think research and conversations that academics have challenging the status quo, forcing us Washington bureaucrats to talk outside of our circles, all of that is critical. That's why the summit's so important, and I'm so thrilled it's in LA. We're just going to get different voices than we normally get.
Great, Carrie. And I think we're going to start wrapping it up soon, but I want to, something that you said is absolutely, I think, is consistent with follow-up after the summit. Summit will open doors, and universities, think tanks, and others can take advantage of that opening to expand it. To your point, a few weeks ago, I was in Argentina, just happened to be in one of the universities that focuses on international relations, and there was an U.S. embassy sponsored course where the professor had been brought by the USG from the US and was giving a course on US foreign policy in the Middle East to a consortium of Argentine students, which I think goes to your point. But I'm going to push back on something only that I believe in what you said. I just don't think that we're doing as much as we could be doing, especially when compared to China. So I grew up in the Cold War. I grew up when, part of our soft power was precisely what you've talked about, these scholarships and opening doors and introducing our culture and winning people over. And I get a sense instinctively that we do a lot less of that these days, but we certainly do a lot less than that when compared to the Chinese and the Chinese in the region. And I can't tell you how often I talk to counterparts in the region. They talk about the dozens or maybe hundreds of scholarships that the Chinese are offering for their people to go to China and study for free that pales that makes the U.S. offer pale in comparison, right? So we've got the right idea, but I don't think we had the scalability, and certainly not the scalability that we had earlier, and certainly in the Cold War. Sort of a commentary on my part. I'll let you talk about that, but let me throw one more issue, and maybe we can incorporate that in some closing remarks that you can give. I'll give you sort of the last word to address that. And I think it's because it's important. We haven't addressed this, and the question is, what discussions regarding increasing the role of women in peace and security and the protection of women across the region? Broad question, but you can get at it from whatever direction you like and incorporate it into some sort of last comments.
It's a grand theme. So yes, absolutely. Women should be at the table. They're not at the table enough. Most of the security threats that face citizenry are a burden that women bear more than men, not just in wartime, but gang violence, trafficking in persons. I think the more we involve women at the table, I think the efforts by the Women in Peace and Security, the efforts to include women and children in the peace accords in Colombia, I think the efforts in between the NALS, the North American Leaders Summit that happened between Mexico, Canada, and the US that focuses on women and indigenous rights. I think all of this focus on underserved, underrepresented, under-resourced groups is incredibly important, because not only do they bring knowledge, they bring experience, they suffer more for some of the security violations and lack of citizen security. So how do we do it? I mean, we're doing it. We need to continue to do it. We're having to undo a lot of societal norms. We're having to go all the way back to, maternal health. We're having to go all the way back to childhood education to get girls into school, into STEM programs, into college, not married, access to healthcare. All of that needs to happen in order for women to continue to be available to be at the table. So again, if you take any problem that I've addressed, it's a macro system. I cannot address migration by doing one thing. I have to address the entire suite of problems, which would have been a better place to end. But I do want to address China takes people to the US, to China to go to Chinese universities. But if you look at the open doors number, Latin America sends their kids to the US because we have strong universities and we have wildly engaged and intelligent diaspora communities that encourage them to come there. They have family, they have opportunity. I think that, a free trip to China sounds fun, but at the end of the day, when you get to China and you see some of the ways the Chinese government treats their people, some of the repression, the way that education is taught, people see through it. They know what a fun trip is versus what a partnership is. One of the things you didn't mention in my bio, because my bio is too long, is that I was the director of English language programs for the Department of State, and English language is a massive value add that study in the United States has. It's as much as Americans are learning Spanish, Latin America and the Caribbean, well, not the Caribbean, but are learning English. It's creating more and more bridges between us. I think that the US continues to work heavily to get US students to come to Latin America, so that there's a lot more shared community between both the U.S. It's not just students coming to the U.S. U.S. students need to continue to study abroad. I think the linkages that we build will continue to build on the natural affinity and partnership that already exists in our region. China can continue to offer trips for military or for students or for government leaders, and that's great. But at the end of the day, who's your partner, who's your ally, who's there, who's been there, who's going to remain there. And I think the summit's going to be a really important opportunity to showcase those partnerships and how much we're committed to the region and how much we share and how much we can do together. So I'm really looking forward to what comes out of the summit. Good and bad. I mean, I think the last point I'll make is that it's a little simplistic, but we are a bit like a family. I'm not expecting everyone to come and get along. It's a Thanksgiving dinner. There's going to be some spats and disagreements, but at the end of the day, turkey or samosas or no, that's India. Sorry, I just
empanadas,
salteñas, salteñas.
Vegan empanadas,
salteñas, some alfajores.
Thank you so much, Carrie. You're a good sport. I know that you had to jump in at the last moment, that you're feeling, under the weather, but I think you did more than enough justice to this. I think you brought it all in. You didn't run away from anything, and we covered a lot of ground. So I want to thank you for peeling yourself away from the over-the-counter meds. And
if I could show you the level of drugs that I have right next to me.
So I'm probably committing some sort of faux pas, but I'm going to say it. Carrie's literally in the midst of fighting COVID. So and she didn't sound that hot when I talked to her yesterday. I could do this. Exactly. So anyway,
we're good.
Anyway,
no,
I applaud you. I
really
applaud you for running in and taking over and wrestling with this issue. You did a great job. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Juan. I appreciate it.
Over to you, Randy.
Thanks, Juan. And I want to echo what Juan mentioned, Deputy Assistant Secretary Hannon. Thank you so much for joining us today and providing us some of your experience and expertise. And Juan, absolutely masterful job of moderating. I'm going to try to emulate what you've done today in future sessions. But we're going to keep this going. Very excited for our next panelist. So I do ask that our panelists go ahead and turn on their webcams and microphones. We're going to get started now on the re-examination of the 2003 Declaration of Security in the Americas. And to moderate this discussion is a very, very good friend of mine. We were just on the phone last night, just talking Latin America and the Caribbean and in general, and what we can do to support our partners in the region. So Dr. Ryan Berg is a senior fellow in the Americas program and head of the Future of Venezuela initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also an adjunct professor at Catholic University of America and a visiting research fellow at the University of Oxford's Changing Character of War program. And it's very likely you've seen one of his thousands of publications on any sort of news sites. So I turn it over to you, Dr. Berg.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much, Randy, for that overly charitable introduction. As Randy said, my name is Ryan Berg. I'm a senior fellow with the Americas program at CSIS. Thanks so much for joining us for a conversation on the re-examination of the 2003 Declaration on Security in the Americas. Before we jump in, I just want to go over some of the logistics for the event, which will last approximately 75 minutes. Following some of the panelists' opening remarks, we'll have a moderated discussion, and then we'll field questions from the audience. I want to remind folks that there's a Zoom Q&A button at the bottom. Throw your comments and questions in there, and we will get to them in due time. As Randy likely reminded folks at the beginning of this session, we do have simultaneous interpretation today in both Spanish and Portuguese, and at the bottom of your screen, you can see the little globe button that says interpretation and select the language that you wish to listen in. We have it in Spanish and in Portuguese. Again, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for a very important conversation on the re-examination of the 2003 Declaration on Security in the Americas. Nearly 19 years ago, the Special Conference on Security met in Mexico City to discuss a follow-up to the Summit of the Americas meeting in Santiago, Chile in 1998. With this special conference, the attendees strive to expand on topics relating to confidence and security building measures, analyze the meaning, scope, and implication of international security concepts in the hemisphere, and accentuate peace as a value inextricably linked to and a fundamental pillar of democracy, justice, respect for human rights, and respect for international law. Leaders from the hemisphere emphasize the need to develop common approaches to tackling disarmament and arms control, revitalize and strengthen the institutions of the inter-American system, and discuss the future of Western Hemisphere security. The conference stressed the unique value that the Western Hemisphere possesses to be able to reaffirm principles, shared values, and discuss common approaches to generate sustainable change and fortify the democratic foundation that the Western Hemisphere is built on. The declaration recognized that the states in the hemisphere face both traditional and non-traditional security threats, in addition to new and other challenges that necessitate a multidimensional approach. I think it's safe to say that given the document was negotiated almost 2 decades ago now, the security threats then barely scratched the surface of the threat landscape now. For instance, cyber doesn't really make an appearance in the document at all. Since the implementation of the declaration, the region has certainly experienced shifts in leadership in regimes as well. Given that democracy was affirmed as a fundamental pillar of security, the region's backsliding and eroding democratic consensus is indeed concerning. Notably, Latin America and the Caribbean is home to the only 2 countries in the world, Venezuela and Nicaragua, that, according to the democracy think tank International IDEA, in the last 2 decades have backslid from functioning representative democracies through all the forms of regime hybridity and eventually to consolidated dictatorship. Lastly, today's discussion precedes the Summit of the Americas, the first the US has hosted since the inaugural summit in Miami in 1994. And notably, insofar as we can discern a summit agenda, security is not really a strong feature. And so I hope that in some ways the discussion can substitute for that. Today we have a star-studded panel to discuss security issues in the hemisphere. Our first panelist is Senator Jose Miguel Insulza, an accomplished Chilean politician, lawyer, and academic who has occupied several important positions in his country's government and the inter-American system. Most of you likely know him as the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, which he served from 2005 to 2015. Earlier in his career, Insulza served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Secretary General of the Presidency, and Minister of the Interior. He's been serving as a senator in Chile since 2018. Our second panelist this morning is Dr. Cecilia Farfan Mendes, Head of Security Research Programs at the Center for U.S.-Mexico Studies at the University of California, San Diego. She is also an affiliated researcher with the Center for Studies on Security, Intelligence, and Governance at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, or ITAM, based in Mexico City. Dr. Farfan is an expert on organized crime and U.S.-Mexico security cooperation and co-founded the Mexico Violence Research Project, an online platform providing analysis and resources for journalists and policymakers on violence and organized crime in Mexico. Our third panelist this morning is Dr. Rebecca Vil Chavez, who recently was appointed president and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue. And since I haven't yet gotten a chance to congratulate her on her recent appointment publicly, I want to take advantage of this time to do so. Dr. Chavez served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2013 until 2016, where she prioritized women, peace, and security initiatives, combating the militarization of law enforcement, and expanding defense institution building programs. Earlier in her career as a tenured professor of political science at the United States Naval Academy, her research focused on democracy, rule of law, and human rights, including teaching courses on Latin American and Caribbean politics, democratization, and U.S.-Latin America relations. And fourth, our final panelist is Ambassador Anthony Phillip Spencer, a retired brigadier general and currently ambassador of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to the United States. He has more than 35 years of experience in the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, where he served in a variety of roles, including as the Vice Chief of Defense Staff. He speaks French and Spanish fluently and is an avid reader, thinker, and innovator on issues related to organizational development, change and transformation, leadership and management, and strategic security decision-making and public policy implementation. So with that said, I think it's clear that we have an expert panel this morning on tap to discuss this re-examination of the 2013 Declaration on Security in the Americas. I want to begin with the opening statements of each panelist. And so Senator Insulza, over to you for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, and I'm very happy to be here. Congratulations for this meeting, and I think that coming before the next summit of the Americas, it's a very relevant issue. This is a very relevant issue. Of course, security, as the problems of security have always been with us, and the Declaration of Security in the Americas, which was adopted in Mexico at a special conference in security in 2003, is our principal guide on security matters, and I do believe that it's still very much valid. Actually, the declaration had its roots on the transcendental shifts in the strategic, political, global, and hemispheric situation that had occurred in the previous decades before 2003. We had new democracies everywhere. The wars in Central America had ended. The so-called national security dictatorships had already been giving way to democracy in most of South America. So it was time to review the whole concept based on the Cold War of security in the Americas. And several new issues were introduced. It's called the basic concept in the conference is multidimensional security, but that doesn't mean that it covers everything. I mean, I think that a warning is warranted here. It's not a matter of saying, as the national security doctrine said, that everything is security. Rather, security is a job for everyone within democracy, and the ideas that we set forward in matters of security have to start from the concept that we have, that they respect human rights and that they can be developed only in a democratic society. Now, between 2000 and between 1998, when at the Summit of the Americas in Santiago, Chile, it was decided to have a declaration on security, and 2003, of course, we had unfortunately 9/11, and that made the declaration stress very strongly the matters of terrorism. But at the same time, I think it's very important that the nations of the hemisphere recognize some new prospects and new problems in matters of security. Probably they had been there before, but never so strongly. And among them, I want to mention, of course, terrorism was certainly in the declaration. The organized international crime, transnational crime, the problem of drugs, corruption, money laundering, illicit traffic of arms, and all the connections among them. And even though there are some other matters such as natural disasters and problems such as, of course, AIDS at that time, but today it's also our COVID problem, etc. They were recognized there. I want to put a special focus on the first part of this. Of course, we have big problems in all the Americas today. I mean, Latin America is by far the region of most organized crime in the world. And if you look at the figures of the UN figures, in the first 10 countries with more crime in the world, we have 9 Latin American and Caribbean countries. So this is certainly, from my point of view, the main threat. I agree that we have several other matters to deal with, but the issues of transnational and international crime, the issues of drug trafficking, the issue of corruption, money laundering, and also human traffic also is very strong today, and we haven't been able to deal enough with it. I think that we need much more coordination. And if I were to review, I don't think we need to review the declaration, but if some part would be needed to review, it would be cooperation in these matters of international crime, drug traffic, armed traffic, human traffic, etc., that are really drowning us. Let me tell you, well, probably I'm speaking from the country that, according to the UN figures, has the lowest figure in crime. That's true. But then crime has doubled. Murders have doubled in my country in the past year. And the rise of organized crime was something that was talked about. And sometimes, today is the main problem in Chile. If you talk to people in the streets of Santiago, Chile, they will tell you that crime and organized crime are the largest problem in the hemisphere. So if we're going to deal with matters that have to do with all the continents, we have certainly to agree that this issue is probably outstanding in the summit for the Summit of the Americas, and it should be outstanding when we analyze our very good declaration on security in the on multilateral security in the Americas, which is, from my point of view, very valid, still very valid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Senator Insulza, for your opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Farfan, Mendes. Cecilia, it's great to see you. Over to you for your opening remarks.
Hello, Ryan. It's great to see you too, and good morning to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to join you this morning for this conversation. So let me begin my remarks by saying that 2003 was a very different time for Mexico. Even though we hosted that meeting, we were definitely not discussing violence and security in the way that we do today. So basically, almost 20 years later after that declaration, I can also say that the context of which how we discuss Mexico in the context of this declaration has changed considerably. I agree with Senator Insulza in terms of how he's mentioning how these threats have evolved. And I agree with the point of organized crime and the impact that it has had in the region. But I would also like to highlight that we're also at a point where the human costs of misguided approaches to some of these threats have really the numbers that we're seeing are staggering. So just recently, the number of overdose deaths that was announced in the US is over 100,000. This week, Mexico also passed that threshold of over 1,000 people who are missing and are disappeared. And not to mention, of course, the high homicide rates that we see in the region. So I would just like to highlight again that those human costs that we're seeing in terms of security compared to what was 2003 are staggering. I am also very concerned, and you mentioned in your intro remarks as well how some of the threats from 2003 are not mentioned, right? Like cybersecurity. But I would also point out of how some of these violences that we see in the region have shifted and even spill over to other areas. And so I'm very concerned, for example, about the violences that women experience in the region and that we continue to see. Of course, some of the numbers and statistics that we observe have to do with having better ways to measure that violence. So I understand there's that element to that, but certainly the violences that women face every day in the region have also shifted, and that's something that's not to be disregarded. And similar to journalists, especially those who focus on investigative journalism and who uncover the links of corrupt dealings between, of course, government officials in different levels of government, as well as violence that's happening in Mexico. I'm going to be very brief with these open remarks because I really want us to have this conversation. And I'm just going to close this first round by saying that I know as academics, we are very good at sometimes at saying what doesn't work, and we're not as good at saying what works, right? And what has been effective. And so I would like to say that on the positive note, and what I see as a space of opportunities, that I still believe that these international instruments are provide a space of opportunity. And if anything, if we have seen some movement in terms of where the region is going, how security has been managed, I would say that it has really to do with what has happened at the international level. And so the hope is that those discussions that take place at the UN and that I understand, for example, and other, of course, international venues. So we'll see as feel-good exercises and just diplomats patting each other on the back really have an opportunity to be implemented in the domestic side. And I'm thinking specifically, for example, of UNGAS 2016, where there was a very strong push to think about drugs and in the region, not from a security perspective alone, but really thinking about them from a public health perspective. And so that really is a shift in tone that I think, the region is slowly moving there. There has been, of course, some backsliding in some countries, but I think that is an important international instrument. And, just recently, I think also what has been achieved on the Commission on Narcotics at the United Nations and thinking about the links between drug trafficking and firearms trafficking, which may seem obvious to us, but at the same time, having it reflected on an international instrument, again, I think it's important. So I have reasons to be concerned, as I mentioned, these shifting violences and how they have altered the lives of women and journalists and activists in the region. But I also think there's some room for optimism with these international instruments. And I really hope we can get into a conversation about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farfan Mendes, for your opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Chavez, for your opening remarks.
Good morning. It's really great. It's really great to be here. I want to thank Florida International University. This conference is something I always look forward to. And Ryan, it's really great to see you. So I thought, first of all, I think this is a great opportunity to reflect on multidimensional security on the eve of the Declaration's 20th anniversary. And I actually kind of like spending time reading through the document served as a great reminder that a lot has changed. And as Ryan said at the get-go, it doesn't fully reflect today's security picture. So I thought I would do is very briefly touch on 5 areas that I think we as a hemisphere should prioritize that either get no or very little attention in the 2003 document. The first one is climate change. It only comes up once in the entire document, and it's on the penultimate page, and it's 2 sentences beginning with climate change could constitute a threat or concern. And I think we've moved beyond that. So I think that climate change and its impact on security should be at the front and center of all discussions about hemispheric security cooperation. And just it's important too to keep in mind that climate change is representative of today's threats that transcend borders and that require cooperation and coordination among countries. The second is related to climate change, and that is humanitarian assistance disaster response, which should also receive greater attention given the increase in extreme weather events, especially its impact on the countries of the Caribbean and Central America. And this I just wanted to highlight also because typically this is a role where security forces or the military can step in, and of course, always in support of civilian authorities. And the Inter-American System, the Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, which is actually mentioned in the 2003 resolution, has been working very hard on developing a hemisphere-wide disaster relief mechanism. And I have to say here to my dear friend, Anthony Phillip Spencer, who was a real force for good on this initiative in the Inter-American Defense System, and who I very much worked very closely with in the lead up to the CDMA and Trinidad and Tobago on this very issue. The third has already been touched on, and it's internal security, crime and violence. Senator Insulza talked about this, so did Cecilia. I think any future document should highlight that this is one of the principal challenges. And also in its discussions of solutions, I think it's important to be clear that militarization is not the answer. And we've learned this the hard way. So I think there should be wording that highlights the needs for stronger justice systems to deal with the impunity issue, but also police reform, strengthening the police. And of course, this is closely tied to issues of democracy and human rights. I know I'm going quickly. I want to go through this so we can get to conversation, but the declaration was written in the wake of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And as such, I'm grateful to see that this document, or to be reminded that this document actually includes a short paragraph on enhancing the participation of women in efforts to promote peace and security. We've made a lot of progress since 2003 through national action plans, and we see women playing a much greater role in decision-making when it comes to conflict prevention, conflict management, and conflict resolution, but we still have a long way to go. And finally, I think that the declaration does mention the importance of protection and assistance to refugees and asylum system seekers. So I think this should play a much bigger role in future conversations, especially in today's context. I know we're all familiar with what's going on. It's a region-wide crisis, the 6.1 and counting Venezuelan refugees, the issue of Nicaraguans leaving, fleeing the political oppression and the economic crisis in Nicaragua. And of course, Haitians that are fleeing, a very fragile state. So I think going forward, we need to really work on this. And also, as we're thinking about ways to deal with this as a hemisphere, recognizing that militarizing migration policy and pure enforcement is not the answer. So I'll stop there. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chavez, for your opening remarks and for those 5 priority areas that you've highlighted. I think we'll come back to quite a few of those in our moderated portion of the discussion. Last but not least, I want to go over to Ambassador Phillip Spencer for his opening remarks. Ambassador Phillip Spencer, it's a shame we can't do this in person. We're neighbors. I'm right across the street from your embassy, but nevertheless, good morning to you, Ambassador, and over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berg. I hope you're hearing me clearly. Let me begin, like others, by congratulating the Jack Gordon Institute at FIU for hosting this 7th annual Hemispheric Security Conference. It's an important annual forum for reflecting on both the observations from the past and opportunities in the future for hemispheric security. I must also acknowledge the other distinguished panelists who have spoken before me. I recognize in particular now Senator Jose Miguel in Sousa, whose leadership, in fact, as the OAS Secretary General during the first decade of the DSA, and when I say DSA, I'm referring to the Declaration on Security in the Americas, I was privileged to observe firsthand. And of course, I must also acknowledge Dr. Rebecca Chavez, the current and barrier-breaking, as I refer to her, first female president of the Inter-American Dialogue. I've always regarded her as a mentor and friend. Good to be here. I'm now meeting Dr. Farfan, so a pleasure to meet you. But in my observations and outlook from re-examining the DSA, I've noted that from exactly 1 year after its adoption until today, I have been personally and intimately engaged in pursuing its aspirations and promoting its achievements. So essentially, I've always been a DSA champion. And without being repetitive of my distinguished fellow panelists, the DSA expressed at the time the imperatives for all countries and citizens in the Americas. The need to update our concept of security in a global security environment that we know was reshaped by 2 major events. Major geopolitical shift, where we assumed there would be a unipolar world after 1990, and of course the tragic events of the terrorist attacks on September 11th. In summary, the DSA represented the culmination of the 12-year process that Senator Insulza referred to, which began in Chile in 1991, and principally informed our outlook for what we thought would be a unipolar global geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geostrategy, and of course, global institutional governance. What's interesting is that in this hemisphere, during that 12-year period, what I refer to as hemispheric and regional summit diplomacy thrived, so that we had a wave of assumed and asserted shared geopolitical identity, ideology, and interest. And this was happening despite the fact that there were warnings from Norman Govan, Cooper, and Heine, and several others that, and I just quote here a little bit from Heine, developments over the past decade, and he was looking back in 2009, the developments over the past decade have significantly altered the political, ideological, and institutional landscape of Latin America. It also inspired, I think as others have commented, lots of institutionalization of summits. So we have the summits of the Americas, you had Mercosur and regional organizations. So you had Mercosur and SICA in 91, the ACS in 94. And of course, we had some important instruments in the hemisphere, SIFTA and SICTE in 97 and 2002 respectively. So together with the Declaration of Bridgetown, where we adopted the multidimensional approach to security in the Americas, what we had was a necessity for simultaneously, in a kind of Rosano type perspective on the complexity of the day, we had to embrace the continuity, what we need to continue doing, or what was changing in the global environment. And so that's where the DSA, as I understood it, came from. Ivelaw Griffith, I think it was in 97, he tried to suggest that sovereignty was under siege, at least in the Caribbean. But of course, we had to continue that state sovereignty and state security dimension of our hemispheric security outlook. And at the core, that really reflected the promotion and protection of power and interest. And coming from a small country in the hemisphere, power was not or is not really what characterizes our security reality. And our interests are generally meant to be very carefully negotiated in the space. So member states themselves declared, however, that security is strengthened when we deepen its human dimension. And if you want the specifics, that's in fact in subparagraph 4E in the declaration itself. So my outlook as I conclude is this: beginning with the current realities of migration, it is this human dimension of hemispheric security, which is characterized by the imperatives of transnationality, multidimensionality, sustainability, diversity, inclusion, equity or justice, and resilience, that I think must now be the future focus of the DSA. The DSA has already embraced fully transnationality and multidimensionality. We heard Senator Insulza describe that. It hinted at the prioritization of sustainability, and thank you, Dr. Chavez, for pointing out that climate change was mentioned in that one point. So, there's a hint at the importance of sustainability, and it mentions social inclusion and social justice only in passing. So in conclusion, it would now appear necessary for the DSA as we go forward to be updated to reflect more integrated, inclusive and innovative focus on at least 4 cross-cutting and complex priorities. I don't have 5, I only have 4. And these priorities, on which I'll comment further during our interactive dialogue, are resilience, inclusion, sustainability, and equity. So in the future, I'm going to focus a lot of my comments on those. And specifically, we need to give greater consideration now on promoting what I describe as equitable security and sustainable security. Yes, we must continue to focus on the multidimensionality and transnationality and all that, but there's an issue of equity, social justice, social inclusion. Yes, several of those people who feel as though their rights are not secure. We now have to lift our gaze and focus on those. And I think only then we'll really enhance what I would describe as a coherent, collective, and concerted pursuit of improved security in the Americas. Equity and sustainability, in my view, are absolutely necessary for justice and peace in the Americas. Thank you again for allowing me to contribute to this dialogue, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Phillip Spencer, for your opening remarks. Thank you to all of our panelists for those enlightening and illuminating opening remarks. I want to remind folks who are tuning in that there is a Q&A box down at the bottom. As folks say things that generate questions for you, please start populating the Q&A box in our Zoom chat. Also, just want to remind folks that if you are listening in English, you'd like to listen in Spanish or Portuguese, we have simultaneous interpretation. Hoy tenemos interpretación simultánea durante el evento para nuestra audiencia hispanohablante. Hay un icono del globo que encontrará en su pantalla y que dice Interpretation. Elija español. Agora, para nossa audiência que fala português, se você quiser ouvir o programa em português, clique no ícone no globo, na tela que diz Interpretation, e escolha português. Let's jump into the moderated portion of the discussion as folks are hopefully asking questions to populate the chat box for our Q&A. And I want to talk about the Summit of the Americas. It's right around the corner. We're getting slow trickles of information about a potential agenda for the hemisphere and for the Summit of the Americas. But we don't have that much information. And so insofar as we can glean, I think it's clear that security isn't going to be one of the focal points. And so I want to ask each one of our panelists, should security absolutely be one of the focal points at the Summit of the Americas? And if it should be a focal point at the Summit of the Americas, give me an issue or two that would be on the agenda in your opinion, given the limited nature of these meetings, the fact that you can't have too many agenda points and so forth. I'll go through and start with Senator Insulza and go forward in the same order that I started. But just some quick responses on, should security be one of the main focal points at the Summit of the Americas this year? And if so, give me your top one or two focal points within that agenda point. And Senator, you're muted.
Okay. No, I fully agree that security should be an issue. I mean, I think that the main topics today between Latin America and South and the U.S. basically have to do with matters of security in several senses, in several directions. Cybersecurity, of course, is also one of them. I should say. The traffic of arms. Most of the arms that are used in Latin America by gangs in Latin America come from the U.S. Immigration has become also, whether we like it or not. I don't think immigration is just a matter of security. It has several other dimensions, but certainly the issue of transnational violence and human traffic and others should be there. I think this is one of the matters that we have to deal with. I mean, if you talk about relations between hemispheric relations, you usually choose crime, immigration. Of course, trade is not an issue today. I mean, I don't think that it's going to move too much in any direction in this decade. So I believe that security would be a much more relevant issue for the summit than any other one that's being dealt with, and probably will be a matter of more unity between in the region, because as you know, there's a lot of discrepancies about the summit and if it should be held or not. Everybody would join a summit that had to do with the security matters. One thing I would just a small point I would like to make is, when I'm saying that security should be the main issue, I don't think that we should rewrite the Declaration on Security. I agree that we should deal with the matters what Cecilia spoke about. We dealt with those in the 6th summit in Cartagena, the drug matter, and more attention to health treatments than to other matters. I agree with that cybersecurity was not there. Maybe we could add them in an annex declaration, but unfortunately, I have to say this: the atmosphere is not good to reopen our main document. We should never try to reopen the charter of the OAS. We should not try to reopen the charter, the democratic charter, and we should not reopen the security declaration, because we don't know if they're going to close in a better way than we have them now. So that would be just a formal opinion. But I agree that security would be an excellent issue to join the countries of the Americas in a very meaningful summit. And now, what matters? Drugs, arms, human traffic. For me, would be the three main matters there.
Great, thank you very much, Senator Insulza. Dr. Farfan Mendes, should security be a major focal point at the Summit of the Americas? If so, what are your top agenda points within that portfolio?
So not that I'm biased, of course, as someone who studies security, but I absolutely believe it should be part of the conversation. I do think, however, of course, that maybe conditions for having maybe robust conversations are not there, but let's assume there were. I think that, having said that, of course, it should be an important matter. I do think that if countries are going to show up and use the same approaches that we have already used and that we know don't work really well, then it would be fruitless. What I would push for in the agenda, if I had, if I could write this letter to Santa Claus, if you will, and I could, introduce some agenda items, I would definitely push for these public health perspectives to some of these questions, firearms, drugs. I think there's been, as I said in my intro remarks, some progress made there, but I think there is much more space to have those conversations about how do we incorporate that public health perspective into these discussions. The other element that I would bring to the table is to really pay attention to the subnational level. We know there's very robust evidence that some interventions at the subnational level, at the local level, can really help solve some of these big security questions that sometimes seem intractable. And so I do think there's a lot of space for using evidence-based interventions at that subnational level. And I don't think countries have really paid attention to that a lot, because I think at times there seems to be a tension between what happens at the federal level or, just at the central level compared to what's happening at the regional level. But just to give a very specific example of what I'm talking about, we know, for example, that naloxone, this drug overdose reversal medication, saves a lot of lives. And when it is used in some parts of the United States where it is allowed, in other parts, unfortunately, there's very strict regulations for that. We know when you have those harm reduction approaches, you can save lives. And therefore, again, these human costs of misguided policies are reduced. Right now at the US-Mexico border, we're seeing also an increase of overdose deaths on the Mexican side, not only by Mexican users, but also US users who are traveling to Mexico. Right now, naloxone is not available. On the Mexican side, it is moved to Mexico via, let's call it informal trade from the US to Mexico. And we know, for example, that something that simple, that is also not expensive, could save a lot of lives. And yet we're not looking at that subnational space, because that conversation is still very much stuck at the federal level. And so if I had my way, if I could introduce some agenda items, again, I would look at this public health perspective, and I would also pay attention a lot to that subnational level.
Thank you, Dr. Farfan Mendes. Dr. Bill Chavez, I like this formulation of a letter to Santa Claus. So if security is on your agenda for the Summit of the Americas, what's on your letter to Santa Claus?
Well, first of all, I just want to wholeheartedly agree with what Cecilia said about, first of all, looking at the subnational level for solutions and also the public health approach. I think those are both such important points. So my letter to Santa Claus would I think, so when we do know that democracy, of course, is going to be a theme of the summit, and the 2003 declaration does, it highlights democracy and human rights. And if you look at the region, one of the, surveys show that there's a declining faith in democracy, that it doesn't deliver. And one of the main reasons there's this declining faith in democracy is one of the public goods it's not delivering is citizen security. So I think that should be front and center. And I think when it comes to citizen security, I would recommend that the nation come together either at the summit. This could be something that also happens in other inter-American conversations. But what is the best way to address this? Again, looking at the subnational level, like Cecilia said, because this, as I look back, this document was written in 2003. It was 2006 when President Calderon said, okay, so we're gonna have a short-term solution to this problem. It's gonna be short-term. We're gonna call in the military to handle this issue. Here we are, 2022, the military has not been the solution. So again, my part of my wish would be a commitment to really focus more on the judicial sector and also on the police. Another part of security that Cecilia, I think I'm a huge fan of yours as I say this, is something else that Cecilia mentioned was gender-based violence. I think that this needs to be part of any discussion. And I think this also hits on Anthony Phillip Spencer comment about inclusive security. We're seeing a huge rise in gender-based violence and domestic violence due to COVID. The femicide rates in some countries in the region are among the highest in the world. Let's talk about that. We need to talk about that. And the final wish list would be, final component of my wish list would have to do with just the issue of protection and assistance to refugees. And again, I think this has to do with Ambassador Phillip Spencer's point about inclusion. I think we really need to come together as a hemisphere, given that just the magnitude of the refugee crisis in our region, and just, you know, irregular migration that is happening really everywhere, that we need to come together and talk about how we're going to do this, how we're going to do a better job in this area. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Bill Chavez. Over to you, Ambassador Phillip Spencer, for your wish list of security is going to be a major theme of the summit.
Great. Thanks very much, Ryan. So I'll make a wish list. I'm not expecting Santa at the summit. Sorry. but I do want to give you a response that might surprise you, given that I'm the current chair of the OAS Committee on Hemispheric Security. I think security is in fact included in what we are addressing at the summit. If you go back to my 4 priorities of resilience, inclusion, sustainability, and equity, so there is in fact a political commitment that we're negotiating. And by the way, I'm Trinidad and Tobago's national coordinator for the summit's process, so that's how come I know. There's a specific commitment that addresses health and resilience. So I'm particularly attracted, like Dr. Chavez, to the suggestion, recommendation from Dr. Farfan that we find a way to properly reflect the public health dimension of the security reality into that political commitment. I'm also, in fact, I want to pick up that citizen security comment from Dr. Chavez as something I'll probably have to go now and see if it's possible to build support for it. Perhaps in the commitment on democratic governance, we need to have something that speaks more specifically to issues of citizen security, the law enforcement and judiciary. So I think from this discussion here, there is opportunity to even further integrate, and I believe in integrating things. That's the only way you come up with coherent responses. And how can we integrate the new perspective of the hemisphere's key security priorities, resilience, inclusion, all of the marginalized groups, sustainability, which is also addressed in that resolution, in that draft political commitment on our green and sustainable future. Yes, so that's how I think security, without being labeled specifically as security, has place. From this discussion, I see opportunities for us to perhaps advance language to even strengthen it. And I fully agree with the comments made by, I know the Senator more as Secretary General in Sousa, but Senator in Sousa, I fully agree with the comments that he made in his lead-off comments. So yes, no wish list from me. Specific things that I feel we could go and try to have included in the outcomes of the summit. And yes, public health, citizen security, a greater focus on migration and refugees, and the other comments that Senator in Sousa suggested. I fully agree. Security is there.
Thanks, Ambassador Phillip Spencer. I want to go right back to you, Ambassador Phillip Spencer, because I'm delighted to say that the Q&A box is indeed filling up, and that's good. That means we're generating discussion. And I did notice that something popped up that was specifically directed at you. And you mentioned equitable security once again in your second response, and this question goes directly to that point. So I want to give you a chance to drill down on this and explain a little bit more. Camila Braga asks, what is equitable security? What should it entail? Please have Ambassador Phillip Spencer elaborate.
Good. Well, thanks very much for, I'm not sure the person who posed the question, but what we need to understand is that equity is in fact one of the greatest challenges in our hemisphere. There is a sense in many groups, marginalized groups, vulnerable groups, they don't feel that they have a fair chance at just living a secure life. Women who are victims of domestic violence, all the other forms and expressions of whether it's gender-based violence or violence against, you have violence against children. We need in our hemisphere to address that issue of equity, which is not equality. Equality is another challenge. Yes? I'm not talking about equality. Just equity. I want justice. So we're hearing discussion more and more of social justice, racial justice, environmental justice. And so we need to craft, just as there is already established a body of knowledge on sustainable security, which addresses issues of climate change and food security and all those other things, health and so on. We now need, as I keep focusing our attention, is the human dimension of our hemisphere's security that I think we now need to pick up. It's mentioned in the DSA. It's there. It's mentioned there. I think what we need to do now is recognizing the challenges that have arisen. We now need to find a way. So equitable security, if I could just end with a fairly clear expression of the concept, is ensuring that our approach to security prioritizes the promotion and protection of all forms of justice for our citizens, putting people at the center of our approach to security. That's what it's about. And I look forward to chatting after. I'm a believer that we have to design the concepts that suit our reality. We need a focus on equitable security here in the Americas. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Phillip Spencer. And Camila, I hope that answered your question as a sort of direct treatment of the issue of equity. I've noticed Dr. Bill Chavez has raised her hand using the Zoom function, so I want to go over to you. I think you have an intervention to make.
No, I just wanted to give an example of what Ambassador Phillip Spencer is talking about, and it's in the context of climate change. And when we're thinking about solutions and climate change adaptation, I think this is an example where inclusion and equity are incredibly important. So I'm thinking about who bears the brunt of climate change, and I'm thinking that, and if we see this in Central America and the Caribbean, that the most vulnerable groups are the poor, women, youth. So it's the subsistence farmers. It is those who are living in urban communities where, low-lying parts of cities with flimsy buildings and, very flood-prone areas. Or we all know about the communities that are built on hillsides, and with the increase in extreme weather events, these are the communities that are getting hit the hardest. So as we think about climate change, for example, as a national or as international security or hemispheric security challenge, I think this is one area where I think it highlights exactly what Ambassador Phillip Spencer is talking about.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Bill Chavez. Super good example of some of the terms that we're using to describe different approaches to security. When I went through the document again, it sounds like we all went back and read, as preparation for this event, some of us multiple times, the 2003 declaration. And the thing that I was struck with most was actually the number of times it recognized democracy as the region's real strength and real asset. And Dr. Bill Chavez mentioned in one of her interventions specifically that one of the reasons we've seen such an eroding trust in democracy as capable of delivering is because of the region's failures on security. Another thing that I want to bring into this is the emergence since the 2003 declaration of what I would call criminal states, states that are very much involved in the transnational organized crime activity of the hemisphere as a matter of state policy, using institutions of the state, for example, to further transnational criminal interests. Of course, I'm thinking about Venezuela, I'm thinking about Nicaragua, to a lesser extent, Cuba. And I want our panelists to sort of reflect, if they would, very briefly on how the declaration perhaps understated some of the capacities of authoritarian leaders who rose in the hemisphere to generate insecurity, to be sources of insecurity for the region. This new approach that we have of fragile states and also criminal states, and how we should be thinking about this, because to me, that's a major piece of the declaration that's missing, despite the fact that the declaration makes a very clear connection to democracy as a major source of security for the region. So I want to start with Senator Sousa and go through again in the order of opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, there's a lot of sirens going around my house at this moment. Thank you very much. Well, I do think that the whole scope of the declaration in 2003 was to have a parallel declaration to the Inter-American Democratic Charter dealing with matters of security. So actually, the democracy was an assumption of the Declaration on public security, and that has not been exactly the case. I think that unfortunately we have the two different cases, as you say. One is that we have some states that have not dealt with the matters of security. On the contrary, some of them are even exporting them. Venezuela is exporting people at full quantities. I mean, the number of Venezuelan exiles is today as large as the ones occurring in the wars of the Arab world. By the way, this is an important thing. I mean, this is an interesting thing. If you look at the numbers of the UN numbers on crime and Asia and all that, Latin America has the strange situation that we haven't had wars for about 40 years. I mean, I think that the last attempt at a war was a small war between Peru and Ecuador in 1994. And at the same time, we have the largest numbers of violent deaths in the world, together with the Arab countries in which we have had Iraq and we've had Syria. And I think that the failure in Latin America has a lot to do with the lack of democracy. Actually, it does have to do with the shortcomings of democracy in the past years. I mean, of course, then we have. I mean, the situations are different. I think that Venezuela is a different situation from Nicaragua. Nicaragua, we have a full dictator as we haven't seen too many times in the past century. I mean, one that does whatever he wants. Somebody that tries to discuss with him, he puts him in jail. You form an organization and it's dissolved and everybody goes to jail. I mean, there's no way of discussing anything in Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega and his wife are in full command of the country. That's one way. Of course, Venezuela is a little bit different. Venezuela is a little bit different, but not that different. I mean, the amount of violence being exported from Venezuela is also as big as the one that still remains in Venezuela. I agree that Cuba is to a lesser situation. Cuba has a state. It deals with matters of crime and drugs and all that, but I mean, most of the dealing of that is always through violence. I mean, there are no real social actors in the situation. So I do think that democracy is connected. But I also think, let me say this because this has been a big problem of the region, that we shouldn't we shouldn't I don't believe exclusion is a good way with dealing with these matters. I think we have to try to keep as long as we can the dialogue among all the countries of the Americas. We should, I mean, the good thing about the Inter-American system, about the Organization of American States, is that everybody is a member. The moment in which we start letting members, I mean, doing things that will make members go out, we will have the same problem that we've had in several Latin American countries. The government changes and the international system falls. In Latin America, we had all kinds. We've had about 100 organizations in the past 100 years, and they have all been dissolved because the governments that created are not there anymore. The big thing about the Inter-American system is that it's still an institution that includes everybody, and or at least tries to include everybody. So I don't think that democracy, I mean, full democracy should be a condition for participation. This, of course, has to do with the summit. I mean, we moved from a summit in which one country was excluded into a summit in which no one was excluded. Now we are moving into a summit in which 3 countries are not going to be there because they are not going to be invited. And probably others would follow that. I don't think that's a good recipe. I think that we should always make an effort as full as we can to have everybody on board. I hate the Ortega regime. I don't like the Ortega regime. I hope that the Nicaraguan people do away with the Ortega regime. But by closing just the doors and saying we're not going to talk to those people, that I think that we are not making a very big progress in this matter. Excuse me, this has less to do with security, but I wanted to say something about the summit also myself. Thank you.
Very timely set of remarks. Thank you, Senator Insulza. Over to you, Dr. Farfan Mendes.
Thank you. I think on this question about security and democracy, I think a lot of times in the region, it feels like we've been building the fire truck on the way to the fire. And I think that's, quite challenging, especially as Rebecca was mentioning, the question of militarization. And so I would like to highlight, of course, the Mexican case, because one of the things that concerns me is that there seems to be less interest and consensus in the need of having civilian institutions as they also relate to public safety questions. And so what we're seeing also is, again, in the Mexican case, which I'm very familiar with, not only that the military and the armed forces are carrying out public safety tasks, which for a number of reasons is not convenient, one of them being the high levels of lethality that they produce in confrontations, related again to the provision of public safety, but also that we're seeing that they are increasingly involved in many other duties that don't even have to do with public safety. And so in the Mexican case, we see them building airports, we see them that they're involved in the vaccination strategy from the government, and as a colleague of mine has pointed out, also increasingly in revenue generating positions, which again is very concerning from the point of view of democracy. So one of the areas that concerns me is not only the states that you were pointing out, but even states where allegedly we should have these democratic controls, that we see the armed forces increasingly acquiring more roles that are hard to see how they're going to let go of them, not only because they include more responsibility, but of course, because they have come with a significant increase in their budgets as well. And so it's not only that they're receiving more funds, but they're also, again, being put in these situations where they can generate their own revenue. So this lack of commitment to creating these civilian institutions that have to do with security and preserving, of course, others that have to do with the checks and balances that we expect to see in a democracy is a trend that really concerns me.
Thanks so much, Dr. Farfan Mendes. Dr. Bill Chavez, democracy and the role or connection to security, as well as some of the backsliding we've seen in the region and state fragility and its connection to insecurity.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and like Cecilia, I think what I would really highlight here is just the growing role of militaries in kind of issues that aren't about defense, are not about national defense, and and her point about civilian agencies that also can check the executive more broadly. We see this with the failure when it comes to the judicial the courts, we see many across the region courts that are not independent, that lack any autonomy from the executive, and also, when it comes to attorney generals, the lack of independence of attorney generals. And I think that the degradation of democracy, as Senator Souza points out, just like with the summit, the 1994 summit happened at a time when there was this assumption that democracy was kind of in democracy was on a rise. There wasn't a threat necessarily of any sort of reverse wave that we're seeing now. But one thing, as a community of nations, that the hemisphere's community of nations, I think we have to acknowledge that we have failed to address effectively the destruction. I mean, the deliberate destruction of democratic institutions. And so, we have the very ambitious goals of the 2001 Inter-American Charter, which, calls for, countries to speak out multilaterally in a unanimous voice, to take a regional stance on this matter. And we've seen that, that hasn't happened. So I think that this is a challenge that we as a hemisphere have to come together to address, because we need to address this as a region, as a hemisphere.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bill Chavez. I want to stick with you for 1 second before I go to Ambassador Phillip Spencer, because we've gotten a question in the chat box about police and police capacity, and it's a good question. You mentioned it, and both you and Dr. Farfan Mendes mentioned it, but I want to have you answer this question because you were DASD at the Pentagon. This is right in your wheelhouse. It's stuff that you were working on when you were working in government. And the question is basically, okay, if we want to reform police, that's great, but and that's the right thing to do. But in many ways, the magnitude of the challenge we face is a question of capacity for the police, or in this case, incapacity. And so that then generally tends to transform these questions into questions of the armed forces, or it tends to lead leaders to look to the armed forces for solutions. And in that case, it moves from being a security issue to a defense issue. So the question is really, what to do. We can talk about capacity building, we can talk about police reform, but if the magnitude of the security problem is such that you have to rely on the armed forces, what to do about that?
And that's an excellent question. And this is something that as you know, Ryan, this is something I focused a lot on as DASD. And because I think this is a trend that the reliance on the military is a trend that we're seeing throughout. We've seen it. This isn't new. We've seen it happening throughout the region. I think a problem is that when you rely on you hear a lot of countries, and I'm going to use the Mexico example here because I know Cecilia probably has something to add. But the intention in 2006 was that this would be a short-term fix. But starting to rely on the military so heavily kind of there were no longer any incentives to strengthen the police. So you had the discussion of the gendarmerie. With AMLO, we have this discussion, this idea that, no, we're going to create a National Guard, but we all know that the National Guard is a militarized institution. So the reliance on the military, unfortunately, takes away, unless you have a clear path, like you have to have an off-ramp for the military, which is going to be involved with gradual strengthening of the police. I think from a US perspective, when it comes to where we're prioritizing our funding, we should be actually, and we saw this under Obama with the Central America strategy. I was really pleased to see that DOD did not have a huge role. Instead of using the money that we had at the time as a USG, as the entire US government, the money instead went to strengthening the police. I think on the DOD side, what money we did receive was spent on defense, went to defense institution building, which is really meant to increase the transparency and the accountability of the armed forces. So, I think this it's not going to be in this. The question is absolutely right on, right? This is not going to happen overnight due to the magnitude of of the security challenges in the region. But we have to develop off-ramps, like a plan. We don't have plans. There's no, how kind of with the steps and with metrics to measure how we're progressing on this matter, so that there is an off-ramp for the military. And the off-ramp might be a little bit longer than we'd like it to be. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to start developing an off-ramp.
Thank you, Dr. Bill Chavez. I noticed that Dr. Farfan Mendes raised her hand. Real quick intervention from you, and then I want to go back, as I promised, to Ambassador Phillip Spencer for his remarks on democracy and its link to security.
Sure. Just very quickly to complement what Rebecca was saying, I think it's not only the off-ramp, but also the commitment from incoming governments to not try to reinvent the wheel every time we have a new administration. And I think that has also been problematic in the region, that with security matters, every administration wants to do its own thing rather than, understanding there may be already an institutional framework to work with. And so this destruction of institutions that constantly happens within the security framework, I think, has also been quite problematic. I mean, for Mexico for sure, but other countries in the region as well.
Thank you, Dr. Farfan Mendes. Switching gears back to the link between the nexus between democracy and security and fragility or authoritarian nature of states and insecurity. Your comments on that, Ambassador Phillip Spencer.
Thanks very much, and I'm happy that I was able to wait, because some of the things that I may have wanted to say have already been highlighted. I go back to my comment in my opening remarks, where we have held on to the issues of state sovereignty and state security, and that state security is essentially about power and interest. So where we have had instances where power and the national interests have been in the hands of state leaders, where transparency, accountability, and all those things that we need for democracy are uncertain. That's how you see the undermining and the erosion of democracy. I also want to remind, and in fact in my notes, supplemental notes, it struck me that the DSA is a declaration. It's not a charter, it's a declaration. So it's not a resolution, it's a declaration. It's an expression at the time based on, there was a sense of euphoria, we were all together, some people were beginning to signal warnings, like Norman Govan, Professor Norman Govan, and others, Heine and others, but that didn't matter so much. But let me now deal with the militarization, armed forces, even law enforcement influence on the promotion, strengthening of democracy. And this is where I want to highlight a specific success of the DSA. The DSA specifically called for clarifying the relationship between the OAS and the Inter-American Defense Board. And I will assert that in our hemisphere, the Inter-American Defense Board, and particularly after its new statutes in 2006, and in fact, we just celebrated the 80th anniversary with a resolution at the Permanent Council 1193. I believe that what was done as a result of the DSA in clarifying the relationship between the OAS and the IADB in 2006 has helped our hemisphere not have the continuation or advance of that type of over-militarization. The professionalization has increased. The Inter-American Defense College has played a major role. And generally, so even through programs like the Defense Institution Reform Initiative, which Dr. Chavez spoke about while she was DASD Western Hemisphere, those have been some of the major things that have helped quietly push back on any risk of military and law enforcement institutions and establishments further or seeking to undermine democracy. There are other areas, and I agree, we need to work at subnational level, we need to work at multiple levels on this, but I thought I shouldn't allow to go unnoticed one clear success of the DSA, which is that it called for, I think it's in paragraph 48 or 49, called for the clarification of the relationship that was done in 2006, 3 years after the DSA was adopted. And I believe that in our hemisphere, we are more peaceful because we were able to succeed at doing that. And again, I refer to the leadership of Senator Insusa, then as the Secretary General of the OAS, in achieving that success.
Thank you,
I
Ambassador.
support the other comments that have been made generally. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Phillip Spencer. I'm cognizant of the time. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes remaining here before I hand it back to Randy, our MC. And I want to give you each a chance to make very, very brief closing remarks before we hand back the panel to Randy. There were a ton of questions in the chat box. We didn't get to hardly as many as I would have liked, but it's clear that we've touched a nerve here with a discussion on the reexamination of the 2003 declaration. And I'll note there are some things that we would have profited from discussing, which we didn't even bring up. There was no mention of COVID-19 and how it might change the security landscape moving forward. And as mentioned, there was a certain geopolitical environment in 2003, which is certainly not the case anymore. And so the word China and the mention of the rise of China and its implications for hemispheric security were not mentioned at all. But nevertheless, I want to give each one of you a chance to make very, very brief closing remarks, and then we'll hand back the panel to Randy. First you, Senator Insulza, 30 to 45 seconds.
Thank you very much. I would like to stress my agreement with Ambassador Phillip Spencer views on equity and equality also in security. I mean, I think that this has been a problem in our countries. Inequality exists in our slum areas, in our poorer areas, but they're much more threatened by crime than the middle class and the upper class. And then we have the crimes that are being committed very strongly during the pandemic. In my country, domestic violence has risen 5 times. It's been 5 times as more as it was before the pandemic. So actually, I do believe that democracy, equality, and are very much linked. I mean, there is a statistical correlation between crime and inequality and poverty. That's a fact. I mean, we don't like to say this, of course. I'm not saying that poor people tend to commit more crimes, etc. But there is a certain relation between the existence of democracy and the existence of more equality with the rise in crime. And that's a fact. I mean, you just have to look at the figures of which are the countries in the world in which more crimes are committed and the countries in the world in which least crimes are committed. And there's a clear relation between democratic and more developed countries and a better security for the people.
Thank you very much, Senator Insulza. Over to you, Dr. Farfan Mendes. Quick 30 to 45-second reflection on today and closing remarks.
Thank you. I'll bring COVID-19 into the conversation so we can mention it once at least. I do think that the pandemic as a security concern offers an opportunity for governments to rethink precisely security and health policies going back to that. So I think there is a space and a window of opportunity for governments and of course other actors to work within that framework if they choose to do that. So I think the pandemic opens up that space. And just to finalize, I want to thank again for the invitation for having me speak here. And again, thank you to my wonderful colleagues for having this conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farfan Mendes. Over to you, Dr. Bill Chavez. Quick closing remarks.
Okay, just thank you. And I just wanted to mention one thing that we didn't talk about that's also in the declaration, and that is the role of civil society. So I just wanted to highlight that as we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I think when we're talking about security and the issues we're talking about, the importance of civil society as an actor in all of these conversations.
Thank you, Dr. Bill Chavez. Last word and quick word over to you, Ambassador Phillip Spencer.
Thank you very much. And civil society, in fact, speaks to putting or deepening the human dimension on security in our hemisphere. And I'll close with this comment I made when I assumed the chairmanship of the CHS this year. Just as we've long accepted there could be no development without security, in the face of the current challenges of climate change, food insecurity, cybercrime, irregular migration, gender and social inequality, violence against women, gender-based violence, and global pandemics, it's now clear that there can be no sustainable development without equitable and sustainable security. That's when we bring security, not only focus on state security, but on human or citizen security, and we deepen the human dimension where we deliver and people feel confident that the democracy that they're being asked to support is delivering on their most important interest in life, to survive and live and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Phillip Spencer. Thank you to all of our panelists for what was a riveting discussion on security in the hemisphere. Senator Jose Miguel Insulza, Dr. Cecilia Farfan Mendes, Dr. Bill Chavez, and Ambassador Anthony Phillip Spencer. Thank you very much indeed for this conversation. Randy, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to all of our panelists, good friends there on the panel. So very substantive discussion, and glad that we were able to finish close to time. So appreciate that, Ryan. Turning over to our next panel on a topic that is no stranger to anyone that's watching the news or on the Twitter sphere or anywhere else, frankly, for that matter. This is looking at disinformation and its impact on democracy and the inter-American system. And I'm excited to see our panelists and our moderator for this, my colleague at Florida International University. Alejandro, you're actually making history. I think you're our first Emmy winner at the conference. So happy to have you moderating this discussion. So Alejandro is the director of the Spanish Language Journalism Master's Program at FIU and Associate Professor of Journalism and Communication, and the Spanish language editor of the South Florida Media Network. He also co-chairs the Journalist Editors Annual Workshop in coordination with the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, a fantastic workshop. If you have not been a part of it yet, I encourage you to go. So with that, Alejandro, I turn it to you. Alejandro, I think you are muted, my friend.
Yes, thank you. It always happens to me. And I'm glad that I'm business casual as my dear guests. And I was worried that if I should wear a tie, but clearly we're in the same environment. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to the Jack Gordon for Public Policy and the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center for the invitation. Welcome all to the panel, Disinformation, Democracy, and the Inter-American System. We have invited a distinguished group of experts to discuss disinformation, one of the main issues in today's hemispheric, global, and local security, as we are learning with the development of the invasion of Ukraine, and just a few days ago with the shootings in Buffalo, New York, and the role of the replacement conspiracy theory. We are joined by Ambassador John Phillip, former United States Ambassador to Panama. During a 28-year State Department career, he served as Ambassador to Panama, Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires in Mexico City, and the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of the Western Hemisphere Affairs. As a Deputy Executive Secretary, he worked on the staffs of the Secretaries Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, in addition to serving in other Latin American and Caribbean assignments, both in Washington and at embassies throughout the region. He'll share with us his experience dealing with disinformation around the region. Carlos Dada, founder and director of El Faro from El Salvador. El Faro was founded in '98, and it's the first native digital news daily in Latin America. Data has reported from various conflict zones, including Iraq, Venezuela, Mexico, Guatemala, and most recently Honduras. His work has been published in Latin America, the United States, Bosnia, and Spain. In 2011, he won the Maria Moores Cabot Prize for Latin American reporting. He will provide the journalist perspective. Paula Rocco is a lawyer and journalist from Argentina, currently working as human rights consultant at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. She'll provide the human rights angle of the problem. And Roberta Braga, Director of Counter Disinformation Strategies at Equis Research. She previously managed global content and campaigns at the law firm Baker McKenzie and served as Deputy Director for Programs and Outreach at the Atlantic Council at Bernhard Latin American Center. Over her 4 years at the Council, Roberta led projects on Brazil, disinformation and misinformation in elections, trade integration, and energy in Latin America. Roberta co-led the center's Alerta Venezuela and Alerta Watch Latin American projects focused on exposing disinformation in and around Venezuela and around elections in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. She will provide us with the challenges and effectiveness of counter-disinformation strategies. Welcome to you all, and thank you for participating in the Hemisférica Security Conference. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to present his and her arguments, and you, the audience, can ask questions through the Q&A. But before we start with our discussion, let's define disinformation. I like the European Commission report's definition. It refers to false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted intentionally to cause public harm or make a profit. According to the report, around the world, disinformation is speedy and becoming a more complex trend based on emerging, unconsolidated, I would add, techniques of deception. It is nested between countless techniques from manipulative information strategies. It threatens freedom of thought and decision-making, right to privacy, right to democratic participation, and unsettling citizens' faith in democratic institutions. The problem has intensified significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Organization for Cooperation, Economic Cooperation and Democracy places disinformation as one of the top 10 world's pressing problems. So let's start with our discussion, but understanding the size and complexity of the problem in our hemisphere. And I'll ask Paula Rocco first, and then continue with Roberta, Ambassador Phillip, and Carlos. Paula, how grave is the problem, and what its a major consequences in terms of human rights?
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I know many of you was expecting to see the special reporter Pedro Vaca here, but unfortunately, due to an important commitment in an official mission, he will not be able to participate today. But I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So first of all, I want to introduce my presentation saying that our office has been addressing the issue of disinformation and its impact on today's democracies for several years. It is important to clarify that although there is no completely univocal definition of disinformation, it is understood, as Alejandro mentioned in his introduction, as the massive dissemination of information with the intention to deceive the public and with the knowledge of its falsehood. This is very important because it's the characteristic that differentiate this concept from misinformation concept. So although disinformation has always been among us, because it is not a new phenomenon, in recent times, it seems to have taken on new characteristics thanks to the emergence and the quick and accelerated development of internet and internet companies. For example, the speed with which information is currently produced and also distributed, the volume of information that is generated, and the exponential multiplication of sources. This has made that disinformation a kind of new phenomena, but it's not. It's something that has pre-existed, the internet. In February last year, after the storming of the U.S. Capitol of January 6th, the Inter-American Commission and the Special Rapporteurship for Freedom of Expression recognized that our region is facing a point of inflection in terms of freedom of expression on the internet that is characterized, among other things, by the widespread erosion of public debate, where democratic states face potential spillover of online violence, into physical spaces with a certain capacity for harm. Also, the attempts to control the public discourse through disinformation and misinformation too, and the compatibility dilemmas between the processes, the decisions, and the business models of private companies with democratic and human rights standards. For the Inter-American Commission, this is a regional challenge that affects all the states of the region, and it poisons much of their internal deliberations, and this challenge will test their future electoral processes and the strength of their institutions. Another very, very important aspect of this discussion for the special rapporteurship is that many times the vectors of disinformation can also come from public officials. In this regard, the 2021 joint declaration of the different special mandates of freedom of expression, for example, it says that political parties should adopt and enforce measures such as, for example, codes of conduct to set minimum standards of behavior to address the speech that, for example, constitutes disinformation. And to resume the different points I have said, in all these contexts, it is very important, the statement of the special rapporteurship, that in this technological reality, challenges as disinformation, but there's a lot of challenges that the internet has brought to us, require applying and reaffirming the principles that guide normatively the inter-American human rights system in order to establish how to protect the public debate, but without affecting the exercise of fundamental freedoms. For example, one of the main conclusions of a very important document that our office has published a couple of years ago, the guide to guarantee freedom of expression regarding disinformation in electoral processes, is that despite there is still a lack of conclusive elements on the effects of disinformation, it seems clear that the deliberate spread of false information impoverishes the public debate and makes it harder for citizens to exercise the right to receive information from diverse sources. And in the end, it is an obstacle to participate in democratic decisions. So in this context, our office has recognized that there is actually a legitimate concern of states, of civil society, even private companies, to deal with this issue. But in these processes of discussing how to create good solutions, it is important to adopt proportionate measures aimed at combating disinformation, but they should be in line with international human rights standards, assuring that these measures seek to the protection of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the functioning of democratic systems. I will leave my presentation here and give the floor to the other panelists, and then we can discuss and deep on the possible solutions to the phenomena of disinformation.
Roberta, I would like to continue with you in sense of the strategies that are being developed, and then what are the challenges that these strategies are facing to tackle disinformation?
Thank you so much, Alejandro.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for the invitation. It's a thrill to be here again. The last time I was here was in 2019 before COVID. So it's quite a different environment to be working in. But Alejandro, to answer your question, I wanted to start with making a point, which is that it seems like we've been, as a society, talking about a growing crisis of trust for so long. But that's kind of where I wanted to start, because I started working in this field in 2016 when Trump was still running for office, and when he had just begun sharing, outright lies in a consistent enough way that it became mainstream narratives. And my focus on it really took off around 2018 in the presidential elections in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, where I think we saw a lot of the same strategies being employed when it came to narrative building, but we also saw a lot more inauthentic coordination, including the buying and selling of likes and shares, which I feel like we hadn't seen before that point.
But back then, I felt like our biggest challenge was pushing home the difference between disinformation and misinformation, which is something Paula really highlighted. Today, though, I feel like in the last few years, as this work has become more mainstream, as more actors have kind of come into play, and as narratives and tactics have evolved, which we discussed briefly, disinformation has almost become like this singular source of our problems. The word disinformation feels like it's become kind of a specter, and it's in itself polarized, politicized all of the time. And so when we're talking about strategies, I think that's important to consider. It's important to understand that disinformation and other kinds of bad information are both a symptom of a crisis of distrust and also a tool for sowing distrust. And it's really marked by a confluence of factors that we're probably well aware of. This mistrust of traditional journalism, this oversaturation of hyperpartisan news content creators online, the use of the term as an umbrella to categorize anything as other. And I think an overall kind of lack of understanding of the nuance between disinformation and political propaganda and hyperpartisan narratives. I think that's kind of where the evolution of this issue has come to, is now a lot of narratives have a grain of truth, but they're very twisted, very reframed, and for oftentimes kind of illicit purposes. So how to, kind of summarize this and kind of go into the solutions. I think one, we're living through an era where we don't even agree anymore on what truth means. We're consuming information in silos where we're reaffirming pre-existing, often more polarized beliefs. And it's gotten to a place, and our research shows this, that people either don't know what to believe anymore, or they're too exhausted from having to figure out what really is true to get engaged. And so people are disengaging, which is another problem for democracy. I think as a society, we've also gotten to a point where we're so used to our information bubbles and so used to kind of hiding our comments behind these like invisible walls online, that more and more disagreement turns to aggression, it turns to violence. And obviously we've seen that playing out in the last few weeks. So kind of pivoting to the strategies, Alejandro, to your question, at ECIS, our mission is really to move past the idea of understanding the Latino community in the US as a monolith, and toward like a more sophisticated understanding of experiences, of issue preferences, of political identities, how people behave, how they understand information, why they believe certain things versus others. And we're really approaching this problem through narrative analysis and counter narratives, including kind of broaching now a space where we're testing counter narratives. So I just want to share a couple of thoughts on what we're seeing. One, when we're thinking about countermeasures or counter narratives, it's important to understand where people consume information. For Latinos in the US and Latin Americans in general, we have a very digital nature in how we consume media nowadays. And for Latinos in the US, that means an over-indexing on consumption of news and information through YouTube and WhatsApp. 47% of Latinos that we've polled said that they consume news on YouTube very frequently on a weekly basis, and over half of Latinos in the US are on WhatsApp, which is more than other sort of communities. So really making sure that we are testing and talking to people where they already consume information, rather than kind of creating these different silos of information. The second point is, I think that we have to understand that Latinos in general in the US, I use this example because this is the group that we talk to the most often, but we're exposed to disinformation and information in general from both domestic and foreign actors. And there's a cyclical nature of content. So narratives in Latin America are often recycled or cycled through into the US and vice versa. And addressing the problem only from one side, or through one actor, or through placing blame only on one country or one foreign actor, doesn't really address the root of the problem, and it can often create, I think, additional issues and misunderstandings. Third and fourth, I think one, we really have to understand the cultural nuances and demographics. Again, in Latino communities, these geographic and generational nuances can open spaces for false or misleading information to circulate. And bad actors often sort of capitalize on pre-existing experiences, shared experiences, fears, experiences with different government structures to kind of push certain narratives that are very hyperpolarized. And then lastly, I would say, and this was something that I think we discussed earlier, but I really want to drive home when we talk about solutions, is that when it comes to Spanish language disinformation and Spanish language content that violates platforms' terms of service, the social media companies are really doing a very disproportionate job of labeling, taking down, or overall acting against non-English language disinformation and content violations. And so at the very least, the companies need to do an equitable job of implementing these actions or measures in the same way they do for English. And at most, they can do a lot more information sharing. They can be a lot more transparent about accounts that are going viral. There's just a lot more that can be done there. I'll leave that for the latter section of our talk. But anyways, the bottom line is just, if the problem, like I hesitate to say the problem is disinformation, I would actually say the problem is that our communities are losing trust in news and information more broadly. And now we're at a point where too many people are unsure what to believe, whatever it is that they encounter online. So I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely, that's a trend that we are viewing. And in 2016, I was scared when I heard Rudolph Giuliani said, "The truth is not the truth." And then we started with all these concepts and theories of the alternative reality. And then we have an alternative reality that it's different to what the facts tell us. And I was scared, really scared of this concept and the meaning that it will have for the future of America's democracy. And not only America's democracy, because America's democracy has a repercussion in the rest of democracy as the leading democracy in the world. So I would like to go with Ambassador Phillip to localize the problem and to see how this information is affecting not only security cooperation, but cooperation in general among countries.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Alejandro. And thank you, Roberta and Paula, for some great opening comments. And I look forward to Carlos's comments as well. Let me step back. Roberta made some excellent, very subtle points about the difference between misinformation and disinformation. I'm going to just, for the purposes of making a broader point, lump them together. Not to argue that they should be exactly understood in the same vein, but to make this very simple point. We are at a security conference. Misinformation and disinformation taken together are very clearly threats to hemispheric security. If we think about the right to life as the most basic of our rights as citizens of the Americas, and you think of premature death, perhaps, as and one that is unanticipated and unpreventable, as being robbing of that most elemental right. What do you then say about the preventable death that could have been stopped, that could have been prevented, life that could have continued? That is, in fact, what we've seen as a result of significant amounts of misinformation and disinformation propagated across the Americas during the COVID pandemic. We can talk, and I'm sure we will a little bit later, about state sponsors of misinformation and disinformation, Russia with RT and Sputnik, China with Xinhua. But let's depoliticize it just at the beginning and make this very clear point. This is about security. This is about life and death. Latin America has roughly 9% of the world's population. It has had a disproportionately high percentage of the deaths related to COVID, roughly 6.27 million of them. Let's take a look at the number one offender in that group, and that is Brazil. Brazil alone accounts for about 665,000 death cases due to COVID. You break that down a little further, and the World Health Organization, Pan American Health Organization, puts that at 1 for every 317 residents. when we talk about security and we talk about gang problems, we talk about transnational crime, we talk about climate change, there are very few things that have killed as many Americans, and I use that term broadly, as many Americans as misinformation and disinformation about COVID. Why? Well, where do Latins in particular get most of their information? Roberta had a very good observation about Latins, the Latina community in the United States. That also holds true for Latin America. Where in Brazil did most Brazilians get their information about COVID? They got it from two platforms, Facebook and WhatsApp. And what they found in a lot of those places was a host of bad information that led them to take medically unsustainable and ill-advised courses of action, bad information stemming in some cases from the president of Brazil, who advised his countrymen that COVID really wasn't all that serious and didn't need to be taken all that seriously. Why are Latins so vulnerable to this misinformation and disinformation? And I'm going to posit 2 points. My view, number one, is because Latins are aggressively socially media, not fluent, that's not the right word, but they are aggressive social media users. Latins talk to one another. Latins communicate. Latins go to the Plaza Pública. In previous generations, you've heard the term Radio Bembe, Radio Pasillo. Latins talk, they communicate. Social media is just an extension of that. But think of how when you go back to, La Vecina del Barrio, who would just sort of spout out with untruths or half-truths or lies. Well, all of that is now magnified, and it is hyper speeded up for consumption by Latins. The second reason why I think Latins are and have died disproportionately, Latin Americans and Caribbeans have died disproportionately compared to citizens of the rest of the world from COVID as a result of consuming misinformation and disinformation, is because for as aggressive as they may be in their use of social media platforms, Latins are very, very poorly educated and suffer from very low levels of digital literacy. Doesn't mean they don't know how to use it. What it means is, what I mean by that is they have very poor skills to be able to differentiate. Or in many cases, as Roberta very wisely and correctly pointed out, they're so sick and tired of trying to differentiate what's true from what's not true, what's a kernel of truth from something that's completely false, that they just kind of tune out and it washes over them. I was struck, as I know all of us were, by images of a bunch of Haitian immigrants under a bridge recently, or several months ago now, in Del Rio, Texas. One of the things that struck me about it was these are the poorest of the poor in the hemisphere, but they all had a cell phone. Now they could have on that cell phone gone and with no paywall pulled up BBC in French or Spanish or English, or they could have pulled up other reputable sources of information, but they don't. What they tend to do is they go in the self-editing function that all of us are victim to. They go to what they know best, and that's Facebook, that's YouTube, that's WhatsApp, and it's not Deutsche Welle in Spanish. And so one of the things I think that we have to, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but that we need to think about as we look towards solutions is this issue of digital literacy. And how do we take and make the citizens of this hemisphere better, more savvy, and more well-prepared consumers of the information that they find online? And how can we help them to better understand misinformation and disinformation? I'll leave my opening comments there.
Thank you. Carlos?
Gracias, Alejandro, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm a journalist. I'm the director of El Faro, an independent media from El Salvador now, with a big file problems with misinformation and disinformation in our own country. I think that most of the general points that I had for this conference were already mentioned and much more eloquently by Roberta Braga. So I'll try to just add a few things to that. First of all, is that, and I'm sorry, Ambassador, that I have to begin to strongly disagree with you by the profiling of Latin Americans as people that are illiterates as opposed to other peoples, because I found exactly the same in some communities in the United States, even in New York. So I think it's a mistake to profile Latin Americans in a certain way. You say Latin Americans talk. In my country, they keep quiet, because if they talk, they could die. My neighbors, I lived in New York, and my neighbors in New York made much more noise and talked much more than my neighbors in San Salvador. So I just want to make a point that we should be careful about profiling. Alejandro, why are we talking about this?
Why are
we have been worried about this information for quite some time, but why this is now on the table of everybody as a matter that is urgent and very important?
Well, to give you a simple example, just in Mexico this year, 11 journalists have been killed for telling the truth.
No, I know, I'm a journalist. It was some kind of rhetoric question.
Okay.
Because now this is an urgent matter, because now this is in the context of the crisis of democracy. It is affecting our political systems. It is affecting the lives of our societies in such a way that is disrupting the way we thought. I think that you clearly pointed to the fact of the effects this had in the United States when Mr. Trump began campaigning and spreading misinformation, and it went up to a point that the United States had a democratic crisis that spilled all over the world because of the power of the United States and gave green light to disinformation and misinformation. And it goes hand to hand with the crisis of democracy that I think we should be talking much more, because as you well pointed out, it's not only the fact that our colleagues in Mexico are being killed for telling the truth. It's the fact that that truth that is taking the lives of so many journalists is being now competed by much more powerful machines of disinformation and misinformation. We journalists are now in a position that we have to compete in a position of a strong disadvantage against these forces. Let me give you a small example. It took El Faro, my newspaper, months to document and publish the secret deals between the government of Mr. Nayib Bukele and the gangs and the criminal structures, a secret negotiation. It took us months to investigate that and to publish that. What happened the day after? The power moved its machinery, and suddenly all these accusations against us were exactly the same as the definition of disinformation that you read in the beginning and that Paula confirmed also. These concepts are now being thrown against us. And again, as Roberta said, what has the public to discriminate between what is false and what is the truth? More and more, the job of journalists is also the job of educating the public, or trying to educate the public about how to distinguish a seriously and professionally built or constructed story or material and what is fake news. In El Salvador, the president has built and created on his team dozens of so-called news platforms that basically compete with what we say. So now this is a matter like if it was a popular contest of some kind of who has more fans and who believes more someone. It is a matter of faith. Who do you believe? These people or the other people? It is a matter of faith or of political affinities. That's what information And this information are being put in its place right now. We have, as Roberta well said, a crisis of trust in the work of journalists because we have a crisis of democracy. And we should be talking more and more about this. What happens when we have a crisis of democracy, and we can spend hours talking about the reasons for this, that populists come in. And populists depend fundamentally on their narratives. They need to put their narratives forward and convince people that all the materials, information, or people criticizing them are the enemies of the people. We never saw this, we never saw this in after the Cold War. We never saw this come up to a point of so much power as we saw with Donald Trump. And this is when what worried us became an urgent matter. We are now in this democracy crisis where journalists are now put in a corner. They are being killed, as you well said. They are being harassed. We are being harassed. We are being chased judicially and physically. We are being surveilled, and we are still trying to do our job. And more, the question that a lot of my colleagues pose forward is, for whom? For whom are we doing this job? For whom are we putting ourselves at risk? For whom are we putting this information? We believed that through our work, and this is basically the basic belief of journalists, that through our work, we would give intellectual tools to our communities so they could make more informed decisions, right? That's not happening anymore. We publish something, and the consequence in a country like mine, where President Bukele has more than 80% of popular support, the consequence is more and more public lynching against us, endangering our situation, exactly as you said is happening also in Mexico. And it's much easier for them to do their job than for us. We rely on a method of verification of facts. They rely on a propaganda strategy where they can say anything and it competes with us. And the other problem, which is technological, is that the arbiter of truth now is, how do you call this? I'm sorry, my English is getting rusty. Whatever decides what you get on Google when you search, or whatever decides what you get, the algorithm. The algorithm is now the arbiter of truth. If you read some pages, you will receive information or disinformation that just consolidates your belief, right? They just strengthen your prejudices, and therefore we have lost the common arena to have a dialogue, because you have your own beliefs and I have my own beliefs. And we have come up to the point that when we talk about things like global warming, it doesn't matter what you say about it. You can put forward scientific facts and they would say, that's what you believe. I believe something else. Just as you put, yes.
So basically what's happening is that truth is losing the battle.
Well, I mean, the problem is who defines right now what is the truth? That is exactly the problem.
Well, yeah. So both the facts. How do you see the problem in terms of human rights, Paula? And because the landscape, it's very, very pessimistic in terms of pushing forward the truth to defeat disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So for this part of the panel, and regarding your question, I think something that we are very much seeing in recent years in our region is a lot of like the responses of states to counter misinformation and disinformation are very much problematic, as we have seen. We're seeing the creation of criminal figures that are vague, ambiguous, that in general, they end up criminalizing the actors that they seek to protect. such as journalists, for example. So in terms of different annual reports and thematic reports, also judgments from the Inter-American system, something very important for the Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights, it is that it is crucial that states promote a broader and more informed and multi-stakeholder debate on this issue. It's not easy to look for solutions to these complex matters that affects different aspects of society. Our office has insisted that the states should not establish new criminal figures, new criminal types of sanction to sanction the dissemination of false information, because introducing criminal types could lead our region back to a logic that criminalizes expressions about, for example, public officials, expressions regarding matters of public interest. New criminal figures can also establish a tool with a strong chilling effect on the dissemination of ideas, criticism, especially when, as Carlo mentioned, when we need a journalists talking about very complex and important issues in our democracies, such as corruption, for example. So as a special reporter has insisted, any restriction on the right to freedom of expression must emanate from an formal and material law understood by the Inter-American jurisprudence as a legal norm, passed by the legislature and promulgated by the executive branch. But another important point that the special reportership has been highlighted in recent years, and also in the process of the Americas dialogue of freedom of expression that we are carrying out, is something that has already been mentioned here. That is, it is very, very important for states to promote digital literacy programs or public policies that strengthen the capacities of citizens to distinguish false information from true information, raising public awareness about the exercise of this phenomenon and awakening a critical spirit in them. I think I will leave it here, but I have two more points. I don't know if I have some space.
Thank you, Paula. And I will go with Ambassador Phillip.
Okay.
Is this happening? Do you see any initiatives from governments to try to lead counter disinformation campaigns, or simply?
Well, absolutely. We've seen some. They are by definition very difficult. Let me also just come back very quickly to a comment that my distinguished colleague Carlos made, where he apparently, unfortunately, read into my comments a comparator that wasn't there. The idea of observation is not necessarily profiling. I in no way meant to say that Latins are greater users of social media than non-Latin American citizens. The same goes for digital literacy. We have a very serious digital literacy problem in the United States among English speaking. I was addressing my comments towards Latin America and the Caribbean, as it's the focus of the conference. I think if you take a look at what's happened, Alejandro, in just the last few days with the Department of Homeland Security having to shut down what it very unfortunately called and I forget exactly what the title of it was, but Disinformation Center. Governments are at a decided, I think, disadvantage when it comes to fighting disinformation. As Carlos very rightly says, they have a natural advantage when it comes to propagating disinformation and misinformation. Donald Trump made that very clear. The bully pulpit of any government, whether it is elected democratically, trends autocratic, comes to power via non-democratic or liberal means, government has a serious advantage in being able to put out bad information, disinformation. Take a look at just Andrés Manuel López Obrador and much of the information that comes out in Mexico from his mañanero, his morning press conference. In terms of fighting that information, it's very difficult not to veer into propaganda when you try to do so. If you look at what the United States did very successfully in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s during the Cold War, when it was fighting its existential Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, we employed the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. Well, Radio Free Europe, which was a very successful model, I don't want to take anything away from it, but it was CIA funded. And then it was discovered that it was CIA funded and it became non-CIA funded. But at the end of the day, it tended to be something that was so important that it not be exposed to Americans that you couldn't even get it here in the United States. There used to be something called the Smith-Mundt law, which separated the information that the US government put out overseas from information that it could put out to its own citizens. American citizens, US citizens, historically have not liked to be the subjects of or given propaganda. And yet, as we all know, with the arrival of the internet, with the arrival of new multiple platforms, all those former barriers have been shattered. So I think the answer is yes, governments struggle, Alejandro, to fight and combat disinformation, misinformation. My own view as a former government official is that we don't do it very well, and that the single best antidote to bad information is good information. You don't beat something with nothing. What you beat it with is the work that Alfaro does. What you beat it with is the work that courageous investigative journalists do throughout the hemisphere, across the globe, quite frankly. And in terms of holding truth to power, holding accountable the major interests that tend to push misinformation and disinformation, and I would include among those governments, oppositions, foreign governments, corporate interests, and in many cases, sadly, criminal interests.
Thank you. Thank you. And Roberta, what are the strategies that counter disinformation strategies that you see that are working? Any examples? An example from any government, some institutions? Do we have some services as Chequeado in Argentina, Verificado in Mexico City, which, by the way, now President López Obrador, it seems that he has enough is just to deny what Verificado is saying that it's false. So yeah. Do you see any strategy that is working?
Yeah, so I think the most successful strategy is something Paula raised. It requires a multi-stakeholder approach, and something Ambassador Phillip raised, to create good information, to create a healthier information environment online. I want to make a couple of points. One is that we need to talk more about trusted messengers, because as Carlos pointed out earlier, we're not in a world now where it's true versus false, or it's people believing facts or people not believing facts, or people having information or they don't have it. That's not where we are. That's not what we're talking about anymore, because a lot of narratives, they have a grain of truth or a twisting or a framing. It's a lot more nuanced and complex now. And that kind of was the point I was trying to make earlier about the need to differentiate how we understand disinformation from what is political propaganda and what just might be like uncontested, hyperpolarized narratives. So I wanted to elevate as a solution the idea of identifying trusted messengers in different communities and using trusted messengers and two-way dialogue with communities to create a space where people feel heard, understood, like their views are reflected. I think that efforts that try to do this like one-way communication, especially when it comes from governments, which are not well trusted in a lot of places in the world, that often doesn't work and it exacerbates the problem. It really needs to be about multiple stakeholders creating and offering resources and being more nuanced in how they create counter narratives. I wanted to raise a point because we did a poll on this earlier this year. The question of who is and isn't susceptible to this information and where we can change perceptions. So I really want to emphasize the point that we have to be really careful about how we talk about susceptibility to disinformation. I know that was something that we were debating earlier. It's not, I don't believe it's the case that Latin America or the Latinos in the US are more susceptible to disinformation, not at all. In fact, our poll found that people are responding very critically to any and all information they're getting. And it's not just about education or engagement. In fact, we found that people who are likely to believe false narratives tend to be more politically engaged, college educated, and affluent Latinos in the US. And so I wanted to put that point out there. The second one is, it's not that those people who are unsure of what to believe are being fooled. They're just reacting skeptically to new and contradictory information that's being put out there. I think our environment now, our information environment, is very contradictory in nature. And then I just wanted to put for your solutions piece out there. I think that we found in our poll, again, one of the takeaways was that, and here I'll give some context, we tested 8 disinformation narratives across ideologies and some nonpartisan to test for people's familiarity with it and levels of uncertainty and belief. And the biggest takeaway was the piece about uncertainty, that there are high levels of uncertainty, high levels of familiarity, but it didn't exactly mean people were believing all the disinformation narratives. There was a high level of uncertainty about what was true and false. But the most widespread narratives were also the most likely to be rejected by the people that we polled. And so I think that indicates that when things are publicly vetted in a widespread way, fact check multiple times by multiple stakeholders, to Paula's point earlier, and acted against by platforms and media companies who are labeling, who are taking things down, working in partnership with others, that's where I think solutions come from, is like, it really has to be. But again, this point about, I don't think that you counter disinformation with saying something is false or like saying this is true, this is false. Like, it's really nuanced now. So I think the challenge is countering narratives with sense-making, fact-based, good information and narratives that are elevated by multiple trustworthy messengers. And that really requires also understanding communities. It's not all about government. In fact, I think government, has a role to play, but it shouldn't be a main role to play. And neither should it just be the social media platforms or just news. It's really, everyone has a role, but yeah, so just leaving it at that.
Thank you, Roberta. I want to pick up a question from one of our audience, is Charlotte Martinez, and this is for you, Carlos. How misinformation could be transformed in backsliding contexts or authoritarian regimes like Nicaragua, Venezuela, or El Salvador? How media or civil society can help when freedom of expression is threatened? I think it's a great question.
I think it is. Thank you, Alejandro, and thanks for the person that posed that question. First, thank you, Ambassador, for clarifying your previous words, and I'm sorry if I misunderstood them, and thank you for your words on El Faro. Well, and I'm gonna try to answer that, take from where you left it, Ambassador. You said the better way to counter disinformation is create good information. But I do agree, and that's what we are trying to do. But I think that the question of this person points out to the new situation that we are facing. I mean, populism and authoritarianism is spreading out, especially in the 4 countries north of Central America. Of course, I'm not leaving out Venezuela. I'm just talking about the recent happenings and the new situation in the hemisphere, particularly in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. We are trying to do that, but let me give you an example of how it is getting harder and harder and harder. A month ago, the Salvadoran Congress approved, please help me translating this, a ley mordaza.
Oh, like a lot to shut people up.
I don't know. But,
I think probably it would be we have, you would say a
censorship law?
A censorship, thank you.
Well, that's better. I'm glad it was not my English that is so bad, thank you. No. A censorship law, it approved a censorship law that previews more years of prison sentence for journalists that publish anything about gangs than what the law establishes as a prison sentence for rapists and torturers. We published a story 2 days ago with audios about a Bukele public officer in phone conversations with gang leaders. A judge could easily interpret that as a violation of that law. To publish that story, we had to pull out of the country the authors of the story. Will they be able to go back? We don't know. We don't know yet. That's how harder it's become to create good information in the Central American countries. You're now seeing journalists from Guatemala, from Honduras, from El Salvador, going into exile because they are being harassed by their governments. I'm not even gonna talk about Nicaragua because most of journalists are already in exile and living in Costa Rica. So it's getting harder and harder to create good information. And the other thing is that we have become a story. This is very uncomfortable for journalists. We have become a story. And we have to tell how we are being harassed, how we are being exiled, how we are being imprisoned, how we are being silenced and censored. And when we become the story, we are focusing resources on telling that story that should be used to talk truth to power, as you say in English, or to bring public authorities to accountability. It's getting harder to do that. It's getting harder when I publish this story that takes me months again, and then a whole political machinery starts spreading delegitimization campaigns against us, trying to kill the character, not the information, because sometimes they can't. They're trying to kill the character. So right now, what you see in El Salvador is a lot of voices spreading whatever they want, and credible voices for those government supporters, saying a lot of what for me are unbelievable things about us, about the journalists from El Salvador. In that way, they create a truth that we are the enemies of the people and that we are making up all these stories to attack them. This is a situation I know in a lot of countries in the hemisphere. This happened in Venezuela before. Perhaps, and this is a parenthesis, the singularity of El Salvador is that what you would call the Chavez or Maduro manual is being dictated in El Salvador by 22 Venezuelan advisors that come from Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez teams, which is a singularity probably of El Salvador. But again, it doesn't matter how much we put as an effort into constructing a journalism story, applying journalistic method, verifying facts. I'm putting up a story that took us a lot of effort to put into that. We are competing with propaganda machines that we cannot compete with, at least inside the country. So even if I do agree that creating good information is the best way to counterattack disinformation, it's getting harder by the day. That's all I'm gonna say.
And we are almost finished with the panel. It's almost 12:15, but I want to close. I'm an optimistic. So I would like to hear from you, your closing remarks, if you see light at the end of the tunnel. There's some fact that I like. I like the fact now that social media is the least trusted source of news worldwide, according to Statista. So I know that's pessimistic, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the media, traditional media, news media, digital media, native digital media, which is growing very strong, is not trusted. There's trust in independent and truthful media. So what's your view for the near future Paula. And then we'll go Roberta, Ambassador Phillip, and we finish with Carlos. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alejandro. So to close my intervention and what I see in the close future, I think that that plurality, diversity are an essential part of the right to freedom of expression. And within this framework, the Inter-American System and our office especially places a special emphasis on the protection of certain types of speech, such as political speech, matters of public interest. So when it is difficult to determine the truthfulness or falsity of certain information, I think that presumption of protection of this kind of expressions should be maintained. And another point, and with this I'm closing, one inevitable challenge, let's say, is to find consensus through participatory processes to help establish clear criteria that are consistent with human rights obligations, so that content moderation in terms of disinformation, but another challenges too, are in line with the aspiration of open democracies, with a plurality of voices, media platforms, and opportunities for everyone to be heard. Thank you.
Roberta?
Well, I will frame my closing with a thought and some recommendations. My thought being that we are much further along than we were a few years ago in talking about solutions. And I feel like, if I'm going to be optimistic, Alejandro, that I want to say that people are being more thoughtful than they ever were before. Who knows if I'm being too optimistic, but people are being more thoughtful about how they approach talking about regulation and talking about kind of solutions to the problem. I want to say that, but we are talking about it. And so I think that we're entering an era now where we might see some more modernization of laws that were created many years ago when this environment didn't exist, applying to this. Like, we've often talked about libel, slander laws in the past. Like, how do we adopt those for social media, an era of social media, et cetera? Like, I think we will in the next 10 years see an evolution of that conversation. And some recommendations. I think, it's a step-by-step process. I think there's no like one silver bullet, one solution at all, not even like a set of solutions necessarily. But I think for social media companies, definitely providing more information on non-English content circulating online. And I think hiring and investing in more culturally fluent Spanish and Portuguese speaking moderators, sharing more about the numbers of moderators they have online. For encrypted messaging platforms, really focusing on reducing the tools in the platform that's encrypted that can take content viral behind the walls of encryption. I think WhatsApp did that when they reduced the amount of time you can forward messages to others, and we might have to revisit that now that they have communities. But it's really, if we can't have access to encryption, then we should really be focusing on reducing the tools that take information viral while it's hidden. I think for, government, I think giving, the Federal Trade Commission some additional resources to be more of a watchdog here in the US at least. I think for media, bolstering like government and Congress and others can help bolster ethnic media or local media that plays, I think, a really critical role in providing information to Latino communities here in the US is our example, but I think like in a lot of different places. So reaching people where they are, as I said earlier, and I think overall just strengthening a more like robust year-round digital media infrastructure that's filled with trusted messengers and that is two-way in nature. And then there are all these things that I would say for like consumers of information. I won't go too much into it, but really digging deep on the messenger. If what you're seeing isn't clear cut, true or false, look at the messenger. Really like don't engage with this information directly. Don't retweet disinformation. Acknowledge sort of like shared concerns and really reframe the conversation to official sources. There are a lot of things that we can do as consumers as well, I think, of information. So, yeah.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Yeah, I think sort of looking for optimism, and I kind of I empathize with Carlos and with all journalists. It's hard to find reasons for optimism in the short term. I think long term, however, keep in mind that journalism has been around, since certainly before the time of the Romans, but the Romans had a goddess that was named Fides Publica, the goddess of integrity and public integrity. Journalism and communication have been around because they're part of who we are. At the end of the day, journalists are storytellers, and the very best storytellers are truth tellers. And I think that reasons for optimism are, one, looking to young people and looking to the fact that we have, as Roberta has very accurately said, we've gotten more sophisticated in this conversation. That means what we're teaching collectively to young people is more sophisticated. And over time, I've found that while there's been undeniable democratic backsliding in this region that has really worried me and almost belied my career. I came into the United States Foreign Service in 1990. 4 years later, we celebrated a summit in which all but one of the countries was clearly democratic, and there was a consensus around that democracy. We're not there today. But I think that the reason for optimism might be found in looking more historically at the situation. Social media didn't invent disinformation or misinformation. It's been around, since well before the Gutenberg printing press. Our nation, the United States, was founded with a tremendous amount of misinformation and disinformation floating around by pamphleteers. And yet over time, look at who we as societies tend to revere. We tend to revere the truth tellers. We tend to revere the people who speak truth to power. Now, that again is not a short-term proposition. I think we're headed both in the United States, in Latin America, the Caribbean, throughout the Western Hemisphere, in fact, in the world. I think we're headed, and we are in some very difficult times, and we will continue to be in them for quite some time until perhaps we get to that multifactorial set of solutions, not even a set of solutions, but more practices by people that I think Roberta very eloquently laid out.
Thank you. Thank you. And Carlos?
Well, thank you all for your optimistic comments, especially at a moment when it's hard for me to think in optimistic terms. But again, what I talk to my team and to colleagues all around the world from countries like Hungary and Poland is that, as you all said, this will pass too. And our task is not to let ourselves fall into the trap of diminishing our discourse to the low levels of these propaganda machines. We have to keep on taking seriously our jobs, because when these pass, we hopefully will keep doing journalism. And yes, Alejandro, even in the middle of this turmoil, I am hopeful. Look, what Trump also awakened was activism in the United States, grassroots movements. These grassroots movements really woke up again. We see people on the streets defending the environment, defending the earth, defending human rights, defending civil rights, defending Black lives. We have people on the streets defending all what we have achieved. We are in a transition to somewhere that we are not sure what it is. It's clearly that we are in a transition in the whole world. Again, and I don't want to talk more about the crisis of democracy, but where is this transition going to also depends on what each of us do. My task is to do journalism, and I will try to keep doing it earth on the principles of what I do, because I think that's my obligation at this moment, and because I want to keep doing this when this also passes.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Paula, Roberta, Ambassador John Phillip, for this insightful conversation. And Randy, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience that was so attentive and asking questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. And again, as always, appreciate our partnership at the university. Ambassador Phillip, I know you're coming in from a long ways away on the other side of the Atlantic, so appreciate the time. Paula coming in. Please send our regards to the Special Rapporteur. Carlos, of course, always a good friend, and Jose Miguel Cruz for inviting Carlos to the discussion. Of course, my dear friend, Roberta Braga, you're absolute rock star. I'm sure everyone would agree with that. So this will conclude today's events and discussions. Fantastic day of discussions that will be posted in the coming days on YouTube. So I encourage you, if you are tuning in late or missed part of the conversation, please join us on the YouTube to be able to comment, like, share, and things like that. Alejandro, I appreciate you ending on an optimistic term. I was this close to deleting my Twitter until you brought that positive spin to it. So tomorrow we have a fantastic discussion, big partnership with the Perry Center on tomorrow's agenda, looking more explicitly at the intersection between democracy and security. Matthew Steinholter, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for U.S.'s Bureau for Conflict Stabilization Operations, will be kicking off the discussion with Dean and Dr. Scott Tollefson. And then we have discussions on the institutional challenges to democracies and examining the case studies a little bit more detailed. So with that, I thank you. I invite you back with us tomorrow morning. We're kicking off sharply at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you again, and look forward to tomorrow's discussion.